Assembly's Oversight Committee. I'd like to welcome everybody who's here in the chamber and anybody who's watching us on the webcast. I would just like to say that we have apologies for absence at the last minute from Susan Hall, unfortunately is unable to be with us, and also Keith Prince will hopefully be joining us, but at the moment is not quite here as it is. Can I just remind everybody, if you are accompanied by a smart or mobile phone, to put it on silent, and can I also ask anyone who welcome Assemblymember Prince, and if you have got electronic devices and they've got any kind of vibrating mechanism in them, can you please not put them in front of the microphone, even if they're on silent? That can still be picked up. So are there any further apologies? Apart from
no further apologies.
Okay. Moving on then from apologies and welcomes to item 2, declarations of interest. The offices held by Assembly members are listed on pages 1 to 4 of the agenda pack. Can I also ask members if you have any disclosable pecuniary interests in any item, specific item that's listed on the agenda? I'm going to take silence as a no further declarations. Can we note the offices held by Assembly members as set out at agenda item 2, note the declaration by members of any disclosable pecuniary interests, of which there have been none, and note the declaration by any members of any other interests deemed to be relevant, including any gifts or hospitality, of which there are also none. So moving on to minutes of the meeting, the previous meeting on 19th of May 2022, the minutes are to be found at pages 5 to 14. Can I see if those minutes are agreed? Agreed, thank you. The next item is item 4, which is the summary list of actions, which is found on pages 15 to 28. And I just wondered if the committee is minded to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the Oversight Committee. Is that noted? Thank you very much. And item 5, re-establishment and establishment of working groups and panels. We have a proposal which is before you on pages 29 to 34 of the agenda pack to establish a cost of living working group. Has anyone got any questions that they would like to raise? And I can see that Assemblymember Best has raised her hand.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just looking at the terms of reference. I have a few concerns that this group will manage to capture all of the work that needs to be done under this, and so I'd like to kind of look into how we can make sure this is as effective as possible. Obviously, we know that some of the Mayor's policies in particular have been hammering London for over almost £100 rise in council tax since 2016. This year we had the third highest increase on record. We had the biggest hike in a decade on Transport for London fares this year.
Assemblymember Best, I'm very happy for you to raise the issue of the amount of time, but I don't want to do a rehearsal now of some of the items that I hope the working group is
Thank you.
I
want
cover.
And then we've got as well, obviously, the £12.50 charge up to the expansion and the £15 of the congestion charge. And these are quite wide-ranging policies. And now I don't know how under that one line in point 2, we're making sure that we are capturing everything and going back over the entirety of the mayoral terms, both this one and the previous one. And I would like that perhaps to be strengthened, I think. And the second point I have is that we've, in point 3, used the phrase other devolved administrations and relevant bodies. But I think one that's really important and needs to be highlighted specifically is London boroughs, and to specifically look at London boroughs and how living in one London borough, say for example in Westminster with about, I think it's like £800.50 council tax, to Kingston upon Thames with a £2,200 council tax. I think that's really important, and there might be other things that are drawn out in how living in different London boroughs and what different London borough leaderships mean for Londoners.
Well, it's very interesting that you draw attention to some Labour boroughs with very low council tax like Wandsworth and Westminster, but I've seen that Assemblymember Duval would like to come in at this point as well and comment on the terms of reference.
Welcome some of the comments made by Councillor Best, but not all. But of course, she forgets about the government impact of some of the issues around the cost of living issues as well that will be included. Now, I think what we said when we originally intended to set up this working party in some of the conversations that took place outside the formal committees was that we wanted as wide ranging as possible because we were going to allow the group to decide. But remember, it's not just the work of this group, it is going to inform some of the work of other committees as well. And so some of those issues might well be dealt with by some of the through the committee system that we have here at on the Assembly, and some of them will be dealt with by the group. So I just want to rest assured some of the thinking that Councillor Best says that she's worried about, I think we can calm her anxiety, if I can say that.
So I think we're drawing attention to the fact that the cost of living situation is something that's impacted on by mayoral policy, by local authorities and also by government policy. And I don't think there's anyone around the table that would disagree with that. I think the important thing is how the working group, as it's set up, is able to deal with those matters. And we know that some of the committees are also going to be looking at aspects that relate to the cost of living situation. My understanding is that there is the possibility, as well as once we've agreed the terms of reference and the membership, that sometimes individuals from the other committees might be brought in, and so the work that may be done in more detail in some of the other committees might then be brought to the attention of the working group. Certainly I know when I was chairing the Economy Committee, it tended to have a bit of an interface with the Brexit working group, and so we were very careful to try and make sure that if we did something more detailed in economy, that it was fed into the working group and vice versa. I'm believing that that is the intention in this case as well. So I think that will probably deal with that issue. So can I come back to agenda item 5, and we have 3 things that I would like you to approve, which are A, to approve the creation of the cost of living working group, B, to approve the proposed terms of reference and membership, and agree, subject to the decisions regarding recommendations 2.1 and 2.2 as set out in the report, the size and allocation of seats on the working group and appointing the members to it. Are those 3 agreed?
Chair, sorry, I did raise another point which wasn't dealt with.
Oh,
so
I'm sorry.
I just wanted to ask that we include London boroughs within, it may be within the terms of reference in point 3, but I think it's very important.
I'm fairly sure it will be incorporated
In the actual
into the actual terms of reference. Could you give us a wording that you would prefer then?
So consider the activities and approaches of the government, London boroughs and other devolved administrations and relevant bodies across the United Kingdom.
Can I just see if there is someone who wishes to second that proposal?
I'll second that proposal.
Sorry, yeah, okay. So it's, can I speak? Yes, oh please do. Please come in.
I mean, our remit of scrutiny is, for the most part, over the mayor. So I just think we need to be careful about making, I'm not sure how well boroughs will take to recommendations coming from us.
I've seen Assembly Member Fortune, and I've just remembered to turn back my microphone. I'm going to take a comment from you, and then it's been moved as a proposal, and then you can just vote on it for or against, depending on whether or not you think it's practical to include that change. Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you, Chair. I think the point that Assembly Member Best is making is that it's going to examine the cost of living as a result of policy decisions on Londoners. So what it's looking at is both national, regional and then local policy decisions and how that impacts Londoners and how they deal with the cost of living. So the only addition here to point 3 on the terms of reference was, rather than reading to consider the activities and approaches of the government, other devolved administrations and relevant bodies, it would read the government, local government and other devolved administrations and relevant bodies. I don't see that that's too extreme a change.
Okay, well I think it's up to the members of the committee who want to change it. It has a list that could incorporate local authorities into that current list at the moment, but you actually want it specifically mentioned, I think is the difference. Can I see all those in favour of the change proposed by Assembly Member Best and seconded by Assembly Member Fortune? All those in favour, please. Okay, that's 3. And can I see all those 4? And all those 5? All those against? And that's Nobody, and all those abstaining? I can see 1, 2. I can see 4 people are abstaining. 5 people are abstaining. Okay, so that's going to be incorporated. That change is going to be incorporated. So can we agree A, B and C that I just read out about the creation of the cost of living working group, the terms of reference with the amendment that we've just made, and the membership as set out in Appendix 1? And we are also agreeing the decision regarding the size allocation of seats and appointing those members, also set out in the report. And I am minded to suggest that we leave it to the working group to elect its own chair, but that will be reported back at our next meeting in July, and we will approve that person in July. Is everyone in agreement with all of that? Right, item 6. Levelling up and devolution for London. This is probably going to be one of our main topics of discussion. And we have some external guests who've just enjoyed the previous agenda items. And we're now going to put some questions to you. So could I really welcome John Dickie, who is the Chief Executive of London First, but it may not be London First for much longer. He can tell us about that if he wishes. We also have Ed Hammond, who is the Deputy Chief Executive from the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny. You're very welcome as well. And then we have Jeremy Skinner, who is the Assistant Director for City Intelligence from the GLA, and also Enver, who is the Assistant Director for Group Finance from the GLA. So you're all extremely welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today. Now, as usual, we have some questions that we would like to put to you, and we will try and do that without hesitation, repetition or interruption. And I'm afraid you're going to start with me before we move on to some of the other Assembly members. And the first one, which is really to everybody, so if you can keep your answers relatively brief, because I'm going to ask all 4 of you, is over the last decade, the London Finance Commission has published 2 reports into devolution. The Housing, Local Government and Communities Committee in the House of Commons has conducted 3 inquiries into devolution, and the London Assembly has also run an investigation into devolution for London. And what has been the barrier or barriers to change in this area? And I'm going to start with, I'll start with Ed, I think, first of all. Actually, I'll tell you now, I'm going to work that way along the 4 guests, make it nice and simple.
Thank you, Chair. I think the barrier, the principal barrier, has been, and this is an issue with the process, I suppose, of devolution going back longer than just the last 10 years, is an unwillingness on the part of central government to devolve meaningful powers to sort of regional and local government. The nature and focus of devolution and of devolution deals, certainly insofar as they've been transacted to other parts of England, have been focused on the delivery of very specific, clear, defined outcomes, and the transaction of devolution deals to deliver those outcomes. So it reflects more a sort of contract between those sort of regional or local administrations and government, rather than what we would understand as devolution being a wholesale transfer of powers without restriction and limitation to different bodies, a relinquishment of power and control. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's been so slow to develop, is because of this. I suppose this challenge, fundamentally, it's about a difference of views about where accountability lies, whether accountability for delivery lies downwards towards local people or upwards towards government for delivery of government's priorities. And I think you see some of that crystallised in the local levelling up white paper and the bill that follows it as well.
Well, thank you very much for kicking us off on that. John, do you agree with the points that Ed Hammond has just been making, or do you completely disagree with those or want to add anything else?
Is that me on? I agree with them, and I would just add a couple of thoughts. One is, which is very similar to what you said, Ed, is just lack of political will. And there is an interesting dissonance between the rhetoric of ministers in this government and indeed in all governments I can remember, and their professed belief in local accountability to local people and the devolution of services and resources, and what actually happens, and what I suspect is the institutional inertia of Whitehall that doesn't want to devolve the things that it's in charge of running. And I think that's the thing we have to try and break. And then I think there's a second point about London at the moment, which is because London is in English terms, not in British terms, but in English terms, has got the highest level of devolution already. I think that the focus is elsewhere, and that's making it difficult for London to get the amount of the bandwidth, if you like, to look at the areas where further devolution to London would make sense.
That's an interesting point that you make at the end there. One of the things that often strikes me is that when people move out of holding positions, for example, the Mayor of London into Parliament, that they might say one thing when they're in a regional or local situation. It doesn't just apply to the Mayor of London, but it applies to many others who've made the same journey, that they say one thing when they're in local or regional government and say something else when they're in the House of Commons. Enver, any further thoughts from you?
Just to say that I agree with the previous two guests, and I think it comes down to the optics of how would it look to give London even more power when other regions haven't actually had what they've been asking for an even longer period of time. So I think it would just look unfair for a government that focuses on levelling up to be seen to be giving London more before bringing everyone else up to the same standard. So it's down to optics at the moment, as well as politics. Okay.
Jeremy, would you like to add anything to that? And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about how has the government been engaged by the Mayor and the GLA in the development of the white paper that's just come out?
Sure. So firstly, it's probably worth mentioning that within that 10-year time frame that you've mentioned, there has been some devolution. So the adult education budget in 2019, and right at the beginning of that era, housing and the affordable housing budget had been devolved, and a few other sort of minor powers, including powers to help fund Crossrail, the Northern Line extension. These things sort of have led to tangible results on the ground. I think I'd agree with Ed that the fundamental problem is an unwillingness on the part of Whitehall, both politicians and civil servants. The whole culture there tends to be against devolution, power being the hardest thing to give up. And we are always confronted with that sort of atmosphere, if you like, when we deal with Whitehall. It's also important to remember that for half of that period, the government has had other things on its mind, with Brexit, the pandemic, and so on. You need to devote quite a lot of legislative time to devolve thoroughly and effectively, and arguably the government's attention has been elsewhere because of bigger events. I think in terms of your second question, we've engaged with officials and with ministers on a regular basis, both in the run-up to and subsequently after the publication of the February white paper. And I think some of the white paper shows a little bit of the influence that we've had. I think it's the first white paper that genuinely tries to get into the economic geography of the country in a way that perhaps hasn't been discussed at length before. And we're engaging with government on the metrics that they may use to assess whether levelling up is a success in future. And finally, of course, devolution is one of the 4 planks within the white paper as being seen as the critical tool to achieving levelling up. So
in looking at the Mayor's priorities, or indeed perhaps his ambitions, what would you say his priorities are in pursuing further devolution for London? What would be on his top of his shopping list, if you like?
If we look at the sort of prism of the devolution white paper, I think the first thing is to say, well, let's work with what's in the white paper. So the government has published a devolution framework, which is something we have asked for. So it provides a sort of end state within the white paper. So there are areas in that where London has not yet got the full devolution as set out in that framework. So those things include local control of transport budgets, much more long-term funding allocations, the devolution of AEB, which is currently more delegated rather than devolved, and there is a promise within the white paper to give local authorities a role in designing future contracted employment programmes. We've had some limited influence over those, but not in terms of mainstream DWP funding. And then beyond that, the Mayor has previously asked for greater control over the apprenticeship levy, over 16 to 19 skills, the shortage occupation list, greater control over some R&D funding, and of course fiscal devolution, as you mentioned, going back to the London Finance Commission, which he and his predecessor supported.
Well, I'll come on to the London Finance Commission and its recommendations in a second, but I just wondered, of those ambitions and priorities, which of those would you see as being the most important? Because that is quite a long list.
I don't think that is really for me to prioritise, if you don't mind me saying. Perhaps I have a natural bias in favour of the conclusions of the London Finance Commission. In some respects, the funding for powers is essential.
John, what would you say is the most important priority or ambition to have?
The money.
Money, okay, so we're coming back to the money. Ed, would you agree with that? It's the pounds.
Yes, it always comes back down to financing. Yeah.
That sounds the money. Okay. Coming back to you then, Jeremy, on the London Finance Commission and its 2016 recommendations, would you say that those are still relevant in the current environment?
We haven't done a sort of full review of the recommendations, you know, given particularly what happened during the pandemic and what happened to London's finances. So I would say that the general principle, though, remains valid, and arguably even more so, given that we are very reliant on particular sources of finance. The primary argument of one of the arguments of both London Finance Commissions was to broaden our tax base to make it more resilient for London and other local governments to be more financially self-sufficient.
And I'm going to assume that the answer to this is going to be yes, but is the Mayor still lobbying government on recommendations from the 2016 report, and has any progress been made on broadening the tax base or any of the other points?
Yes, the Mayor periodically continues to lobby. Clearly, we haven't yet seen the level of fiscal devolution that was outlined in the London Finance Commission reports.
I feel like throwing in a comment about the devolution of business rates and the pool and then the changes that went back in the other direction, but I'm not going to. I'm going to pass on to one of my colleagues, and I'm going to ask Assembly Member Caroline Pigeon to come in now. Caroline. Oh, did you want to come in behind me or after Caroline? Yeah.
Sorry, we've moved along quicker than I thought on that. So I want to look at the white paper and the implications for devolution in the capital. Perhaps I could start with you, John Dickie. What do you think are the opportunities in the Levelling Up white paper for London?
Well, I think the honest answer would be modest. So as I said at the beginning, part of the challenge here is London already enjoys a high level of devolution compared to the rest of England, if not the rest of Britain, and the focus is elsewhere. The white paper, in its hundreds of pages, does, I think, make a glancing reference to London not having levels of devolution that other cities like London globally would have, which is encouraging, but there is nothing beyond that in terms of specifics. And Jeremy outlined some of the areas where there is constructive dialogue with government on powers, but those are, in the scheme of things, that felt to me rather modest. And the critical thing is the money. So the sort of tripartite devolution of money, which is first off devolving the existing revenue streams to give greater ability to VAR, to plan, to prioritise locally, followed by the ability to retain those so that if difficult planning decisions get taken in London about density, for example, the benefits of that get retained in London with confidence over time. And then the third bit, which is the bit that requires, I think, particular thought and design, is about the ability to vary taxes. And without that suite of fundamental powers, everything else is fairly second order. And indeed, one of the things which those of you, well, Assembly members will know, those who've been involved in local government will know, governments have a sort of slightly nasty tendency to devolve powers with smaller budgets and then watch to see what happens. And that's, that's not a good outcome for London.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's being radical. It's that you talked about earlier, that actually that political will to do this. And as soon as people get into government, they don't want to. And you see that at all levels. I understand that. Perhaps... Ed, what are your thoughts on, are there any opportunities in here for London, or do you agree with John?
I largely agree with John, to be honest. I think the opportunities really are about trying to have a model and an approach which gives London the confidence that it's going to be able to deliver what it wants and needs to deliver, because there's already a sort of clear sense about, in terms of investment, development, key priorities for the coming years. What you don't want is for the levelling up agenda to muddy those waters and muddy elements of that ambition, perhaps inadvertently. But if you look, for example, at the way that we've not yet talked about the missions in the bill, how might they impact and amend and change the priorities that London government and government elsewhere has, because government is going to expect reporting against those missions? Will that shift attention away from things which local politicians consider to be important towards things which government does through the mission? So it's that drift of focus and attention that perhaps worries me slightly. Opportunities really are about saying, well, it's almost about the opportunity for central government to remove itself from parts of this space and say, kind of get on with it, and for sort of finances and financial powers to sort of follow on from that, really.
And Ed, the paper kind of sets London, the London model, if we can call it that, as the bar for the rest of the country. Is that the right benchmark, or should there be, greater aspiration here?
I think that's a very good question. I think London's governance model is unique, and it's the approach to devolution in London is unique and is kind of bespoke to London. I don't think it's. I think it's arguably simplistic to talk about sort of levelling up, both in terms of substantive policy, but also in terms of governance, to London as a sort of notional sort of top level sort of thing beyond which nobody goes. We've already heard that there are areas where we could go further. The London devolution settlement could go further and should arguably go further as well. It sort of goes back to this issue of the sort of truism that devolution is a process, not an event. It's an ongoing process whereby government and local and regional politicians should be in ongoing dialogue about the drawing down of more powers and responsibilities. It's not a thing where I think that there's a benefit in having a devolution framework. But if that's seen as constraining the nature of that dialogue, then I think you're in difficult, choppy waters. The difficulty, I suppose, here is the nature of that conversation, which certainly in other parts of England has been quite messy and has happened largely behind closed doors, where you've got sort of local politicians and ministers kind of thrashing out agreements on these major issues in a way that isn't really open, transparent, open to public scrutiny. And the devolution framework, I think, will help with that, because it provides more consistency and transparency to the process. But I worry that we're still going to be in a space where these agreements are going to be thrashed out with certain people and groups of people in the room, but certain people, by definition, therefore not in the room, that deals and agreements about what powers are needed and what powers are given will be driven by, not necessarily by a kind of pluralistic conversation in local areas, or also nationally about what needs to be devolved and what should be devolved. It's difficult to know and understand when government's actual practical position is still occluded slightly. The white paper itself was kind of a white paper that had a sort of very much a greenish tinge to it. It was quite discursive in nature. Even the bill, sets out a broad framework, but it's a skeleton for how devolution will operate in practice. We still don't really have a sense from government about practically how they see it actually working. The white paper provides a really, really interesting and sort of thought-provoking foundation, but the proof is very much in the implementation pudding, I think.
So we're not clear really what government is wanting here. And when I look at Greater Manchester, and they have far greater powers over health, for example, and that's something some of us have wanted in the capital, and particularly things like the ambulance service, many of us think should be under the GLA as it's a blue light service. That's not even, there's not even an opening for that in this paper for London, or is there, in your view?
No, well, again, it's unclear, and so much of this hinges, I think, on the willingness of ministers and to a lesser extent possibly senior civil servants, their willingness to countenance having those conversations. I don't think there's anything in the bill that changes that from the position that previously applied. So we are still in this position where there is a lot of subjectivity going on about the judgments being made at national level about what they consider are appropriate things to devolve. It still feels like the process is very much in the gift of government, rather than it being a sort of an even and an equal conversation, sort of parity of esteem between governance and government at local and regional level and at national level.
Thank you. Jeremy, could I come to you and ask you, in the white paper it talks about the establishment of a levelling up advisory council. And just to quote what it says, it will consider how to ensure London's complex economic geography and socio-economic spectrum can further benefit from levelling up. I'm not sure what that really means. What do you think that means? Could this be a good outcome for London? And what do we think, given that line in there, that we can use that to lever in for devolving further powers?
Well, we've certainly been in touch with the Levelling Up departments to ask them about that bit of the white paper, and we found the officials involved in being the Secretariat for the Levelling Up Advisory Council. Of course, the Council's remit is national, and I think their their priority will be some of the other areas first before they come to that London work stream. But clearly it does provide an opportunity for some joint working. We've, on a number of occasions, made representations to governments, both through the London Recovery Board and the GLA, setting out some of the concerns about levelling up from London's perspective. So, yes, it may prove to be an opportunity.
So apart from you found the people who wrote this, what more is being done on that? And are you using, is the Mayor using, for example, the Minister for London to try to lever some influence here to flesh this out and have it as something that benefits London? So
as far as we know, the Council has only met once or twice, so it's yet to establish its sort of working arrangements and yet to establish this London work stream. So we will be in touch with them again in a few weeks' time to see whether they've progressed that further. So in a sense, we're waiting for government to set out when they're going to do the heavy lifting on that work stream.
Okay, and is the Mayor working with the Minister for London to try to influence this? And who is on this Levelling Up Advisory Council? Are you able to reveal that? Do we know?
It's in the white paper,
okay.
So they've listed the members of the Advisory Council.
Is there anyone from London on it?
Baroness Alison Wolfe at King's College London is one of the members. Tim Besley from LSE is another member.
So we've got people on there
so
we
there
can
are people
influence as well.
Indeed.
Okay, thank you. I think that's my questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Caroline. Assemblymember McCartney indicated earlier on that she wanted to come in, and then Assemblymember Fortune, so I'll take you in that order.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for John, if I may. I think concerns have been raised by London commentators such as Tony Travers and Dave Hill that, and I'm thinking particularly in relation to TfL, that the government is interfering more than it has before, that it is in effect trying to micromanage our transport system at the moment. How important is it that we ensure that London retains the powers it has and that we retain that independence?
Well, I think, I agree with the points that Tony and Dave have made. I think the sort of start point here is that the impact of the pandemic on the way in which TfL was funded was extremely severe, much more severe than in other cities with similar kinds of transport systems, because TfL was so reliant on the fare box for its funding. Now, the scale of the impact of the pandemic was such that I think across the world, pretty much all cities with regional transport systems of this kind found themselves needing help from national government. That would be true in New York, where the city and the state obviously have vastly higher levels of devolution than we have in this country, but they still needed federal support for their system. So I think that's the context, and I think two or three things flow from that. One is that the way in which the government has gone about providing funding support to TfL, which, as you will know, has involved considerable amounts of micromanagement, considerable amounts of internal dissonance as to whose idea it was to do that micromanagement and what it was. So one of the things I simply do not understand is why the government thought it was a good idea to tell Transport for London and the Mayor to do a bunch of things that would be locally unpopular, and who did they think would get the blame for that? I mean, I don't understand the politics of that, but well, I'm sure they've got a good answer. The way in which we've seen, as I say, the stop-start funding, so very short-term deals and so forth, is all just an enormous drain of time and effort that could be much better spent doing other things. To be fair to central government, it has, in the end, so far, come up with the goods. TfL has been well supported financially by government, notwithstanding the process points I've made. But what all of this points to as we look forward at TfL and its services and its funding is that there are no mechanisms, or I'll rephrase that, there are very few mechanisms, nothing like the broad range of mechanisms you would need in order to be able to think more creatively about how you provide local funding. There is some ability through the Council Tax Precept. There is obviously the fare box. There is some room around moving to a new form of road user charging, but there's nothing like the diversity of sources of potential funding that you would want to have as a city. And as TfL moves from being in the absolute crisis of the pandemic, when I think we were at 5% of normal journeys being made, into what looks like it's going to be a slow transition and a new set of patterns of usage, it's really important that the Mayor has those different tools so that we can finance the network at the level London needs if it's to drive not just growth in London, but growth for the UK. We need to have those diverse tools so that we can manage that transition, and there can be some democratic accountability in London as to Londoners getting the services that they want and being willing to pay for them. So that, I think, is, as it were, the thing I would be focusing most on now, and indeed to the points that have been made about dialogue with government. In some ways, this is a good time to reopen some of those conversations because central government wants to stop providing funding, and if we're to get a good outcome for the country, we're going to need to find different ways of funding.
Just follow that up, and perhaps I could ask Ed about, I suppose, the point that John's made about if a city has devolved funding, it is more innovative. It can come up with better ideas. Do you see that happening in the levelling up white paper for our city or not?
Yeah, I think there is the potential for that to happen. I think, again, I'd go back to the answer I gave Assembly Member Pigeon a moment ago and say so much of this is kind of hinges, I suppose, on the implementation of this. We have a sense from the white paper of the overall framework and from the bill, but so much of this hinges on sort of the willingness overall of ministers and government more generally to act. The situation that John talks about is kind of is emblematic, I suppose, for me of the wider issues that all of us have already mentioned about government's unwillingness to relinquish control. And this exists in the form of, sort of competitive bidding for small funding pots, for the TfL financing arrangement obviously is another example of that. I think devolution deals and the way that deal making has been transacted also reflects that. it's about government keeping its powers and its choices close to its chest. And with that unwillingness to devolve, government will then, I suppose, there's a risk that government looks at the progress and impact of devolution and says, well, this isn't nearly as significant or effective as we thought it might be, because they have not devolved in the way that, gives those freedoms in a meaningful way. They've devolved effectively against delivery contracts with local areas to say, we will give you this money and then, you will deliver this thing for us. And that's not the same as what devolution is. It's not about creativity. The creativity comes in the nature of the bid to government rather than in the the people coming together at local level and saying, what shall we do ourselves using the powers that we possess and finances that are under our control to move things forward. Government might be part of that conversation, but won't be the judge of the creativity or innovation of those strategies. And that, I think, is the key difference from a decision-making, ownership and governance perspective.
I think that's what Jeremy was saying earlier about devolution, as opposed to just delegation as well, yeah.
Thank you. I've seen Assemblymember Fortune and then also Assemblymember Sahota is now indicated as well. Assemblymember Fortune.
Thank you, Chair. I think we got to the nub of it now in the last couple of questions. Ed, when you said the white paper had a tinge of green, did you mean in terms of environmental policy or naivety?
I meant in terms of it looking and feeling more like a green paper than a white paper. So it's from a policy wonks kind of green. Yeah. Green papers are more discursive. They're more setting out sort of general ideas.
I was playing with you, Ed. It's all right.
Oh right. Okay. Good.
Because it's funny. If you look at the cabinet today, they're going to be what's on their to-do list. On their to-do list is TfL. Modernisation and funding. It's going to be Scottish independence. It's going to be EU, NI trade barriers. What do you think are the political concerns that people have about devolution, just thinking about that to-do list? Enver, what do you reckon? Because you talked about the difficulties with the political decision-making.
Ask it again in a...
Yeah, why, if you think of the list of what's going on at the moment, why do you think there is political reluctance to go full throttle for devolved powers? John used the word blame earlier.
I'm not going for blame. I think there's an element of control and trust. And once you let go of control, you've got to trust who you're devolving it to. In my humble opinion, I don't think the trust is there between central government and some of the devolved powers to go the whole hog.
And that's what I mean about coming down to the nub of the thing. There's my favourite, I think it was Jean-Claude Juncker dilemma that said, everybody knows what to do in government, but nobody knows how to get re-elected after they've done it. One of the interesting things about London devolution that I've always thought is if you think of the mayors we've had so far, you've essentially had mayors aligning with national government. I mean, I know it was different with Ken at first. He was Tony Blair's nightmare, wasn't he, for a couple of years? I think that was the famous joke. But it was a Labour mayor with a Labour government, then you had a Conservative mayor with a Conservative government. And now a lot of the challenges we have are because you've got you've got people from differing parties who are having these conversations. And when we were talking about TfL money earlier and talking about that money coming across and government meddling, it's currently £5 billion raising to £6 billion of national taxpayer money that's being sent there to help TfL get over its troubles. So what do you think would need to be done for politicians at a national level to have that faith and trust in regional or local devolution? Let's go with Jeremy.
I think you're right that the nub of the issue is trust. I think that as much as possible where national and local government can jointly commission research into and proposals for devolution, that would be a good thing. That would be my personal opinion on that particular question.
So agreed outcomes at the very beginning and then...
Well, also a sort of jointly commissioned process, because I think until you have that, you can't explore all the risks and the potential mitigations to devolution. And there are obviously risks to devolving powers. We wouldn't be naive as to think that we could immediately take over vast new areas of services without there being some risk. And that surely is part of the problem with trust. So until you start to examine those issues together, you may not resolve them.
And that's the Goydian knot, isn't it, if you will? So, John, in terms of the scrutiny function that goes with this transfer of powers, how could they be improved? How could they be beefed up?
Well, can I just make one sort of point to the points that have just been made before we get to that, and that is that I think it is fundamentally about people not wanting to let go of power, because if you're running a team in a government department, you're not, and you devolve your power, you've just devolved your point, haven't you? I mean, the good arguments against devolution, which I don't think are particularly good, but the legitimate arguments are, as we've talked about, trust. There is also, of course, capacity and the ability of government locally to do things, which I think in London we've established. So I think that's not an argument that would apply to us. It might apply to some county councils. But then there's also the Treasury argument, which is if it all goes wrong, we central government will end up picking the pieces because we aren't going to let, insert town here go bust, so we will have to come in. But what doesn't get taken account of properly is the other side of this, which is the return that you get from devolution and things being done well, risk being managed more effectively locally. And Howard Bernstein used to say when you talk to central government, they ask local government to prove a near impossible, if not actually impossible, level of risk assurance that they will, everything that they touch will work well. And they ignore the fact that currently we are spending billions of pounds of public money wholly ineffectually in a one-size-fits-all model that nobody could objectively defend. That sort of gets put to one side. So I think we need to make the argument that the status quo is not delivering well, and that's not a risk, that's a fact and an outcome of the decisions, and look at some of these issues in that context. As to the scrutiny, I think there are different views about what role London boroughs might play in London, about the role of the Assembly, and there are different models, and I don't feel terribly strongly about any of them. I think there are pluses and minuses of most of the sort of conversations we've had since the original devolution of powers to London. One of the things I do think requires a bit more thought, though, is if we are going to get fiscal devolution to the level I would like, is how we have checks and balances around this. Because there are plenty of businesses out there in particular who will worry that devolution to London government means making business a milk cow for the provision of stuff, because nobody understands business taxes and businesses don't get to vote. So I think that is the area I would be more keen to see some good thinking on, rather than the sort of the scrutiny of the executive mayor, which the Assembly does now and does, I think, perfectly well.
I think it could have more power, but I think we'll pick that up later, so thank you.
I think we will. I do take your point very strongly about the willingness to devolve power if, depending on what's going to be done with it afterwards, because if you look at the late 1990s and the Blair government, which introduced some of these devolution arrangements, although the first Mayor of London may not have been the first choice of Mr Blair or Sir Tony or whatever he is now, so I haven't quite kept up with what you become when you join the Order of the Garter. Certainly Welsh Labour and Scottish Labour were both very strong at the period when both the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senedd were being established, although you have to be willing, if you're going to devolve, to accept whatever comes afterwards. Assembly Member Sahota.
Well, I think Assembly Member Fortune beat me to it slightly on the issues, because one of the things, of course, you talked about is the political will for devolution, along with, I must go with the political scrutiny of devolution, and, of course, and raising finance. But one thing you keep talking about is the London model, that the rest of the country aspires for London model. Has the London model worked well in terms of the relationship between the scrutiny function of the Assembly and the mayor, and does that need to be looked at also again in order to see whether that's model which other country should be aspiring to? Yes.
Yes, I mean I have said before that the London model is a distinct and unique one, and there have been I've been part of some interesting discussions in other spaces about sort of does devolution in other parts of England mean that you would want to kind of try and create an assembly style sort of model for other areas, and there's a great interest in doing it, but there's a recognition that the level of resourcing needed to be able to support those arrangements would be sort of beyond, I think, what government and others would be prepared to accept establishing in a new institution these days. I think, sadly, because I think that we can point towards the Assembly as because as having been an integral part of the governance framework for London since the establishment of the new arrangements back in sort of 2000-ish, as being therefore integral to the success of those arrangements. And I think you can point to the direct impacts, the positive impacts of the mayoral team of devolved government in London, and the Assembly is an integral part of that. It's difficult to kind of disaggregate its kind of operations and its impact from those of the wider institutions. I do think, though, that the coming changes means that we all have to think about the kind of operating models that these institutions work sort of within. How will the Assembly's work and efforts need to be focused in the future? Because how will the mayor's own areas need to be focused in the future? Increasingly, mayoral governance, certainly outside London, is focused on partnership, working with other institutions, individuals and organisations within the wider area to deliver change. And I think that reflects the fact that individual mayoral powers, and I suppose this includes the powers of the Mayor of London, are to effect change within the wider place, are actually quite limited beyond those things over which he has direct operational control. So it requires you to think about the need to work in partnership, the need to bring in others, the need to be pluralistic in the approach that you're taking, and also because a lot of what you're trying to do is inherently long-term in nature. It goes beyond a single political cycle. So you've got to think about, your legacy, the ability for the things which you're putting forward to be followed through by your successor, who may not be somebody of the same political colour as you. That goes for big transport projects. Crossrail was delivered, started, its genesis came, 20 years ago pretty much, or longer, depending on who you speak to. You look at the big regeneration development projects here in the Royal Docks, Old Dock Common, Old Kent Road, these kind of places. These are kind of multi-decade things which require ongoing political will to deliver. And that requires a governance model that is prepared to think long-term in nature as well, that is prepared to think about the need to horizon scan, that's not focused exclusively on, arguably the sort of minutiae of operational delivery, and which is able to also to move away from a model for accountability and governance which is focused very much on quite old-fashioned approaches, what we call the sort of phrase with which you'll be maybe familiar, sort of new public management, this idea of, reporting against kind of key performance indicators, scorecards, this kind of stuff, which is mechanistic, which arguably doesn't really sort of get to the heart of heart of outcomes and products and impacts on local people. My kind of worry about accountability and governance in the Levelling Up white paper and the bill is that the way that government is proposing to record progress against delivery of the missions has a very, very strong new public management flavour to it. It's about the reporting of data analytics up to government. So therefore, it's about government gathering all this data and information into itself and saying, we're the ones who are making the judgment about what works here. We're the ones who are deciding what is effective, what isn't effective. And we're then using it, the implication is, to decide what we decide to fund and devolve, and what we don't decide to fund and devolve. And that's a fundamental challenge, I think, to a more open and expansive and pluralistic model of devolution, which is about partnership, working together at local and national level, coming to collective decisions and national level, coming to collective decisions, bringing local people along with you about what's important and what isn't for the long term, not what success or failures or what target might be red or yellow within a given quarter, which I worry is kind of what we're doing. I think there's something about the long-term nature of the missions which is positive, but I worry that they'll end up getting drowned in a obfuscated mess of kind of national reporting mechanisms which will sort of focus on outputs and mechanics rather than outcomes.
Thank you for that very full answer.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to Assembly Member Best, who's going to take the next group of questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I think first thing, maybe Jeremy, if I start with you. how could London benefit from further flexibilities in business rates to raise more funding as set out in the white paper?
I think I might pass that one on to Enver as the resident expert on business rates. But as a general point, it seems to me that the ability to set the multiplier to give reliefs and discounts that are more attuned to London's particular circumstances are important, because the current national system means that it's heavily leveraged, so that in order for the government to raise the total amount that it sets from business rates, it can increase the multiplier quite significantly. Now, we know that there will be changes following the revaluation of business rate properties that has taken place recently. We'll wait to see whether the government will stick to those. But that might see a reverse of the trends I've just outlined, because of when the valuations took place, which was right in the middle of the pandemic. But like any other source of finance, if we have reforms whereby the local authority, and in this case London government, both City Hall and its constituent local authorities, those flexibilities are inevitably going to mean that we can direct them towards the priorities of the day.
Thanks. And Ember, moving to you.
Jeremy's covered quite a lot of what I might have said. I think the current business rate model is unfair. It's antiquated. It needs to be changed. So I'm not going to sit here and say we should just have more money based on that current model. I think the model needs to be reviewed, and we've been told there's going to be a reset for about 4 or 5 years in a row now. We're still waiting to see it. We're seeing the impact on the high street, what's happening to business rates. So there's talk around online sales tax, and we've recently sent a response to a consultation to Treasury. I just think we just need a wholesale review of it. There has been some good bits in the past. I mean, if you look at the business rate supplement and the ability to raise £3 billion towards Crossrail, and I think the London has been the only authority in England to have exercised the power of that business rate supplement. But we're coming through a pandemic, and business rate is still based on a very old model, and I'd like to see more power given to the mayor to decide what should work better in London, rather than a national scheme applied to our city, and the ability to retain what is generated and distribute it how he sees fit within a democratic cycle.
So could you define more on those powers that you think would be useful?
What, just in the business rate context, or do you mean taxation per se?
For the mayor in terms of business rates.
I think it builds on what Jeremy was saying around where to apply reliefs, where to apply multipliers, where to increase, where to freeze, to have more discretion around how to help businesses and to engage with communities as well, so that it can be more locally adapted. I don't believe the current system allows that.
Okay, thanks. And Ed or John, did you anything to add on business rates specifically?
Let me just emphasise the points that have been made. The current system is hopelessly broken and needs really radical reform, and it is leading to all kinds of dysfunctional outcomes in London. All the stuff you'll have seen about American-style candy shops on Oxford Street are a function of the way our business rate system works. It's all bonkers, and it was about time a government lived up to the continued promises we get for radical reform, did some radical reform. That said, it would make much more sense if we had a London level of property tax that could be flexed and varied, subject to the kinds of checks and balances I've spoken of, in a way that worked for the London market and for London's needs.
Would further devolution of the Independent Budget Office for London help deliver value for money for Londoners and perhaps increase transparency? Perhaps Ember?
I think just to delegate powers to the OBR for London, are you asking, or
To devolve the powers to London, perhaps to improve scrutiny and transparency, or perhaps not. But
I don't know. I can't answer that. I'm sorry, I haven't thought about that. Maybe Jeremy can.
I can't quite see the merit in that at this point, given the OBR's national remit and role. With relation to John's point about checks and balances, you know, if miraculously London government became almost entirely self-sufficient from its own taxes, which at the moment it is very far from achieving, then you could imagine potentially a role for a sort of regional regulator. But I think we're so far away from that position that at the moment it's not really worth considering too much.
thanks. And sorry, was that a hand? Sorry.
Sort of, yes. I mean, I agree. I think sort of what you could have is, I mean, sort of obviously to improve and enhance scrutiny of, particularly on the sort of, obviously if you're enhancing financial devolution, if you want to increase and improve the quality of overall financial scrutiny, you could think about some kind of politician-led sort of public accounts committee style sort of model, so obviously we've talked about sort of devolution in other parts of England, and the establishment of sort of local or regional public accounts committees that would have the power to investigate and review the value for money of services across the wide of public services across the wider area. So not institutionally focused, but focused on the place. So knitting together the fact that there are lots and lots of different, you know, public bodies with different functions and different budgets, and understanding how that it knits together is and having a single accountability kind of framework for all of that. But you know, how that would work in the London context, I think it sort of remains to be seen. I think in principle, I think you would need, with devolution of financial powers and responsibilities, to create something like almost a kind of locally driven kind of national audit office type thing, which would provide for an independent assurance on value for money. But I'm very cautious about making those kinds of. It sounds sort of potentially bureaucratic. I think if you could do so in a proportionate way, I think it would work. But I think that's rather different to the OBR related question that you asked.
Thank you. And Jeremy, coming back to you, how could the Mayor's Green Finance Facility benefit from further devolution and funding as set out in the Devolution Framework?
I think my honest answer to that is that I'm not sure, and I'll have to give it some further thought. So I'll sort of see whether other colleagues have got anything to say on that one before hopefully returning to it. If you give me a moment. To anyone else?
No. Okay.
If the government were to provide lots and lots of resource to London government to drive the green agenda, it would make it a lot easier to meet the kinds of decarbonisation targets that we've got for 2030.
Okay, so thanks. So on that point then, John, in February 22, the Mayor announced 90 million towards new green bonds, which would apparently unlock over 500 million to finance low-carbon job projects, including jobs. And it's not clear what progress has been made on that. So is it harder to make that argument for more devolution, perhaps, whilst we can't prove what we've done with the devolution we have so far? Do you see what I mean? We need to really actually be using every power we have to its limit before we can be asking for more, because then we can, with a good case behind us, be asking for more devolution once we've made use of the powers we have.
Well, I think it's certainly the case that we do need to demonstrate competence and effective delivery at scale against existing powers in order to make the case for more. I mean, Jeremy may know more than I do about what the progress has been on the bond.
Well, I was going to go back to the white paper, which talks about providing local councils with the powers to deliver innovative proposals to achieve the net zero targets. To a certain extent, of course, London has already got that power to innovate. The problem really is one of scale, and one of the issues in London of scaling proposals is the fact that we're such a big city, and we have 32 local authorities. So that's an inherent problem, an administrative one. I think also when it comes to retrofitting properties, more generally, the way the market is split in terms of tenure, but also the way it is split in terms of the infrastructure companies that deliver power and water, makes it very difficult to achieve the kind of scaling of those sorts of programmes. But it is clearly a matter that we need to work on to achieve the Mayor's 2030 target.
I can see Enver wants to come in.
I was going to come back not specifically about the green finance, because I think the bond, you can ask that question later on the agenda, because you've got people coming to talk about resourcing of that team that's going to be issuing that. I think that is making good progress. I think you were asking about like powers around the green agenda. I think I understand the question a bit better. And I was working with 12 different cities last week in Oslo around the green agenda and budgeting for it. And in some countries, some cities have actually been given legislation that allows local politicians to influence what they can do in their area. So in Oslo, for example, they have got zero emission on their construction sites. And they've passed a law so that all of the plant and machinery and all of the construction is devolved to the mayor, and they can actually influence that. It's not specifically green finance. It's about being able to give the local power to achieve that part of the agenda, and I think that's slightly off track from here because we've been talking about money, but there is an element around planning and permission and pushing that green agenda forward that can still be devolved to exercise those powers locally.
Chair, we have similar powers, perhaps the powers aren't far enough, because obviously the Mayor has been able to make certain restrictions on construction sites, especially on the vehicles used as well. So I think we do have very similar powers to the ones you mentioned already devolved. Is it not that they don't go far enough? Perhaps. Is it because we do have something similar, but perhaps the argument is not that we don't have it, but that it doesn't go far enough.
It might be a compliance issue rather than a power.
Perhaps that's one for us to ask the scrutiny team just to check into the ins and outs of that, because I suspect it may be more to do with the vehicle movements, because we have some controls over the road rather than specifically over the construction sites. We have discussed it in the Environment Committee, and I'm slightly dredging my memory for what we discussed. Now Caroline Russell is going to prove that she knows the answer to the question.
I think this is the issue of non-mobile road machinery, and there are not enough powers to clean all that up, and that is a significant PM2.5 particle pollution problem in London.
There we are. We got
Well
to
done,
NRMM.
thanks.
We've worked it into an oversight meeting. How did we manage that? Are you?
Thanks. There's one more on here. Sorry, I've got that environment, but we do have something though, right? Sorry, there is something, but it's not going far enough. Sorry.
I think there's not, as far as I'm dredging up from 2 years ago when I was chairing Environment Committee, but I think that, there's a problem of there not being sufficient powers to be able to insist that all construction site vehicles and that non-mobile road machinery, those really big machines, they're not included in.
We have
there's
more
no
control.
powers to.
We have more control
control
on the roads. We have less
Yeah.
control on the actual construction sites. That's the difference.
Okay. And finally, Jeremy, to what extent is the GLA coordinating the London Borough's applications for funding to unlock brownfield sites for housing?
I think I'll have to pass on that because I'm not responsible for that particular area of work. If I might direct that to the Regeneration and Economic Development team. Enver may have more knowledge on that one.
I don't know in terms of coordination.
Might be something that we need to check with Housing and Land, in which
Housing
case,
and Land as
and I think we'll.
Perhaps we could ask for a written answer.
I think we'll
Is
get
that
a written. Well, we'll ask Scrutiny. Just check that with Housing and Land. Now, Assemblymember Fortune, thank you very much for those questions, Assemblymember Best. You indicated you wanted to come in. Was it again on this section? You came in
earlier. It's already been covered, Chair.
You've already covered it. Okay. Was there anyone else who wanted to come in on this section? Going, gone. I'm then going to move on to Assemblymember Ahmad, who's now going to lead some further questions.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. And this is a question to you all, what would the impact of jobs and growth be moved out of London and shifted into the other areas of the UK be? I know you've touched on it, but if we could unpick it a bit more. So perhaps we could start with Ed.
We're sort of moving rather out of my sort of direct area of expertise here. I suppose I can talk about this from sort of more general perspective, and the extent to which we're talking levelling up is or should be talking about a sort of zero-sum game of sort of moving jobs out of London or moving jobs out of sort of and economic sort of. And it should be about creating more. In other spaces, not sort of drawing things from London and moving them out to other places. So I certainly I would hope that the agenda is focused on that rather than on saying let's move existing, let's shift our existing growth plans, or let's shift existing jobs away elsewhere. But I realise that obviously doesn't really quite answer your question.
That's okay. Perhaps we could move along to John.
Well, I think that the direct way levelling up might affect jobs in London is if the government moves government jobs out of London to the regions which it said it's going to do. There are, I'm not quite sure there is a number for this, a few thousand jobs that the government's planning to move jobs from the Treasury to Darlington and so on. And to be perfectly honest with you, I think my view would be pretty sanguine about this. If that results in a lot of capable people who are currently being ineffectually used by government to do stuff, being freed up to go and work in the private sector at a time of very acute skills shortages, I think that would be rather good for the London economy. So it's not a big driver of London's future. What is a bigger driver are some of the benefits that devolution could bring from the policy aspect of the white paper. So I touched on this earlier. In central London in particular, allowing local authorities to retain the taxes from development in those areas will create a strong incentive to build better and more densely in a way that creates a whole range of wins. It will be unpopular, often with local residents, but you are creating a level of resource that will make it both easier for local authorities to manage this well and engage well, but also that will give local people something back from scale development, and I think that would be really good for London. So from a policy point of view, there are definitely levers that could be pulled, and from a direct government spend perspective on jobs, I think it's kind of marginal, could be good.
Thank you. Enver, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree with John's point around the sort of relocation of public servants into other parts of the UK. I don't think it's significant enough to alter London's economy. I think it goes back to the long-term funding issue. If the devolved powers were to give the mayor more long-term funding so that we can strategically plan over our capital programme over 20, 30 years, then we can invest into the capital in terms of our infrastructure, our transport systems, and those would generate jobs both in London and outside of London. And I think that the current, just to make the point, the current short-termism that we're facing is actually one of the biggest hindrances to job creation.
Thank you. Jeremy?
Yes, so to put some sort of figures on what you've heard, London is host to about 6 million jobs, 4 million of those taken up by Londoners, around 2 million commuters, or at least until Zoom Shock happened. So the government's proposals to move about 20,000 jobs out of London are not that material. We've seen relocations in the past, and mayors have been pretty sanguine about those proposals because London is at the heart of a global economy. I think the bigger threats are things like visa and immigration rules, but also kind of whether the government still wants London to be the economic growth engine, and if so, that it will ensure either investment into London or give us the fiscal powers to enable us to invest in London's growth, which was the original argument of the 2013 London Finance Commission, which I think is still relevant even as we come out of the pandemic and all the impacts of Zoom shock somewhat affecting that balance about where people are going to live and work.
Thank you very much. As we know, London has some of the highest levels of poverty in the UK. However, this bizarrely hasn't been reflected in the allocation of funding from the Levelling Up Fund to date. Hambleton, which is often described as a millionaire's playground, was allocated £66.46 per head. Central Bedfordshire, £90.79 per head, and Bromsgrove, £148.33 per head. In London, where we have some of the poorest boroughs in the country, Barking and Dagenham was allocated £3.93 per head, Islington 18p per head, and Hackney 16p per head. And it looks like Barking and Dagenham were actually doing quite well in that scale. Are those allocations from the Levelling Up Fund a bad omen for what London can expect from the Levelling Up agenda? And I wonder if I could start with you, John.
Well, I think it would be fair to say the government is not as clear as it could be on what it's actually seeking to do fiscally around levelling up. There are, as you said, a number of funds that have been set up, or the competitive bidding kinds of beauty parades, which London has been excluded from, and there are some where London's got a woefully modest share given the kinds of pressures here. The government, I asked this question to Michael Gove, as it happens only this morning at a conference I was at. The government seems to get that levelling up is a bit more complicated than looking at average income in the northwest and comparing it with average income in London and concluding that that's level. The government is talking now more about levelling up between communities and the sort of complexity within regions, which I think is a very positive step. So quite what all that means for mainstream big decisions about spend just remains, I think, wholly unclear. At one level, if the government wants to create a strategic fund for hanging baskets and London doesn't get to bid for any, that's not terribly fair, but it doesn't terribly matter, provided the government does continue to do things like fund TfL, which really matters to London. But if it goes much beyond that, then we will be in a world where we have neither the powers to raise the money ourselves nor the ability to provide the vital investment London needs. And that will mean London over time sees its competitive position eroded against other world cities. And that will obviously be bad for London, but it will also obviously be bad for the Exchequer. It's very difficult to see how over the medium term you level up in this country if London isn't generating the nearly £40 billion tax surplus it was generating before the pandemic. So I suspect within government there are all kinds of complicated currents between those who understand that, those who want to continue to invest in what will drive growth in the country, those who wish to be seen to be levelling up. And quite how all this shakes up, I don't know. I guess one final point is what we could do with is a bit more transparency on all of this. There may be, take for example, some of the debates we've had about culture and taking money out, the perennial debate about, London is a national institution, so London gets a big share, and so when the government wants to be seen to do something, it announces it's going to take money out of London and give it to, theatres across the country or whatever. That may be the right thing to do. I mean, reasonable people can have different views on what's the right strategy for funding culture in Britain. But what we shouldn't be doing is pretending that taking money out of one place isn't taking money out of one place. It is levelling down. It might be fair. You can have that argument, but it's pretending it's not. And I think that clarity is what we deserve as a minimum. It'd be nice to have a bit of consistency. It'd be nice to have a bit of predictability. But transparency would be a good first step.
It did, in your conversation with Michael Gove, did he say that we're going to get that transparency?
The point he made was simply to acknowledge there are all kinds of challenges in London, which the government is aware of. It didn't go much farther than that. But as I say, that is a step forward from the original rhetoric around levelling up, which did look at things like pay levels in London on average versus North West, without taking account of the extraordinary levels of inequality in London. So averages don't tell you much, or looking at housing costs in London, which are much higher, so that actually once people's housing spend has been taken into account, wages in London aren't higher than much of the rest of the country for an awful lot of people earning ordinary levels of remuneration.
Thank you. If we could move that way, so Enver, if you could answer.
I agree with everything John's just said, actually. I think I would just echo that we haven't had enough transparency around the funding formula review, and I'd welcome an opportunity to work with officials in the relevant departments to represent London's perspective in that. At the moment, we're just not hearing anything, and it would be good to ensure that levelling up for the rest of the country isn't at the expense of London, which at the moment I fear it might be.
Thank you. Jeremy?
Thank you. Yes, it's not just the levelling up fund, it's also the Growing Places Fund, previously the Towns Fund, where there was insufficient clarity about the purpose of those funds. But I think it's quite easy to look at individual funds and make an argument. We really need to look at the totality of public expenditure, and it is a bit more even if we look at the historic record. Whether that will remain the case in future, we don't know. But it does create a mindset in Whitehall where it's believed that levelling up means don't give money to London, make sure your allocations of government pots are to other parts of the country. And as John says, that's an explicit levelling down approach when it materialises. I think the second thing to say is that levelling up, almost by definition, is with reference to London. But an early critique, I think, by the Centre for Cities of the White Paper was that we should really be thinking about levelling up in terms of our mid-tier cities and their European counterparts, Frankfurt, Munich, places like that. It's probably wrong to compare some of our cities with 1 or 2 million inhabitants with the 9 million global city that London is. London is competing with Paris, New York, Tokyo, as we know, and it's our mid-tier cities that historically have languished economically. So in that sense, it's perfectly sensible to have an economic strategy designed to improve the fortunes of those cities. But it's done too much, in my view, with reference to London. And going back to your first point about inequality, the white paper itself refers to, different patterns of spatial inequality being seen at the regional level, down to the city level, and then even at the neighbourhood level. I just wanted to quote from something that the Recovery Board put together last year before the white paper was published. Variations within borough boundaries, as in other parts of the country, are substantial, making statistical comparisons between local authority areas alone insufficient to assess progress towards levelling up. The challenges for people on low incomes, in insecure work, with few skills and qualifications, or facing other barriers to employment such as poverty, inaccessible workplaces and conditions, caring responsibilities or ill health, need to be addressed wherever they live. And I thought that was a powerful statement that levelling up can ignore the problems that individuals face, which is ultimately what we're all trying to help improve.
Thank you very much, and that's a lot of food for thought there. Thank you. And Ed, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, so I think potentially in an ideal world, the presence of the missions would provide a coherence, more coherence on the way that this funding should work and be kind of allocated, and rather than this kind of a balkanised mixture of different funds with different priorities and different objectives, the missions provide a degree of consistency, not only within funds that are controlled by DLUG, but also around cross-government action, because the whole logic about this agenda is that it's meant to be a cross-government agenda. It's meant to be about the way that other government departments and other parts of government engage with this overall levelling up objective. The idea is then as well is that through the use of the missions, you're developing more transparency and consistency over how you're allocating funds centrally, if that's the way you're going to go. You're saying not just that certain areas should be funded over others, but that if you're using the missions as an anchor, you're making more of a reflective, I suppose, judgment on those wider sort of economic determinants that the missions are meant to focus on. I do agree, though, that there is this danger that there isn't a recognition of the. Obviously, people talk quite a lot about the sort of agglomeration effects of London, and the fact, frankly, that investment in London pays back more than it does in other places. Sort of you invest in, government invests in London, and it unlocks things like developer contributions in a way that it doesn't in other parts of the country. And the position I completely agree that you want to get to is where you've got the system in place to be able to unlock the same kind of benefits in smaller cities and smaller conurbations, rather than saying, let's somehow try and drag that investment somehow in a way that doesn't make sense economically into a different place and assume that developers, the private sector, other parts of the economy are going to say, oh yes, this makes sense to us somehow, even though it obviously kind of doesn't. But I think underpinning that is this issue about clarity, consistency about objectives, consistency around accountability and responsibility from whom and to whom is kind of fundamental to kind of making that work. Otherwise, you end up, as you've said, with those weird kind of outcomes in terms of who's getting a particular pot and who's being prioritised over other, depending on a skewed sense about what you're measuring against.
Thank you. And my final question to Jeremy is, how is the Mayor ensuring that London is represented in levelling up policy?
Well, the Mayor is obviously tries to represent his views and those of Londoners in a variety of forums. The M10, the collection of mayoral combined authorities, mayors, is one such forum, through direct representations to the Secretary of State, through letters to ministers and so on, the usual mechanisms. I can't enumerate the number of sort of interventions we've made over the years on this and similar agendas.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. I think Assemblymember Best wants to just come in now, and then we're going to move on to Assemblymember Sahota for some more questions. Assemblymember Best.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to kind of make the point here. Obviously, London funding is, I think, about £2,000 per capita more than anywhere in the UK. Obviously, our transport services are the best funded in the entire country, more than any other region. And my concern is that we haven't perhaps touched on enough what levelling up the rest of the country does for Londoners. The way I view it is that London is a bit of a brain drain for not only the UK, but for across the world. And actually what that does is pushes those that are born here, raised here, to really struggle to find those jobs with the competition they're put into, as well as, a multitude of other reasons. So perhaps if we could touch on what levelling up the country means for Londoners as well.
So the white paper refers to some of this, that growth in other parts, and I was perhaps wrong to say that the comparison shouldn't be between, that levelling up should not be referenced to London. Maybe I should have qualified that by saying it shouldn't be referenced to London exclusively. So there are obviously relationships between London's growth and what happens in other parts of the country. And the white paper explicitly says that growth in other parts of the country may reduce pressure on public services in London. I think the problem, though, is that it is not clear from the white paper what the government expects in terms of the trajectory of growth for its capital city. The white paper is silent on what it wants from London, and we've pushed officials a bit on that particular sort of absence of policy. Because if London still is going to become the jobs generator and the tax contributor to the rest of the country, then it will still need an investment plan. It will still need investment in transport, infrastructure, housing, skills, and so on. It's just that we have that current absence from the white paper.
Should I just add? I mean, it's of vital importance for all the reasons that have been discussed already that the city regions of the UK perform better than they have done over recent decades in terms of jobs and growth, and that they perform as well, as Jeremy has said, as similar cities elsewhere in Europe. So it is a real failure of post-war Britain that we've only got one large city that has a higher per capita income than the national average, and that's London. That's not true in France, it's not true in Germany, and it shouldn't be true here. So there's the objective of levelling up is absolutely right. It's when it becomes levelling down, either implicitly or explicitly, that's when I start to have a problem. And as Jeremy has said, there needs to be a plan for London and London's role in the British economy. And it is worth reminding ourselves that the economy of central London is really, really different to the economy of elsewhere in the UK, and indeed pretty much the rest of Europe. London has a global critical mass of different sectors that agglomerate and produce what is by a mile the highest level of productivity in Europe. Now, that is critical to Britain's future. And if we do not nurture and enhance that and seek to level up in parallel, we are going to find it very difficult to fund some of the things we want to fund. Because if London is not, as I said earlier, delivering the kind of tax surplus it historically has generated, a whole bunch of difficult issues for government around redistribution and creating opportunity are going to become a whole lot more difficult.
Okay, thank you. And so just coming to our last 2 or 3 questions, and we'll move over to Assembly Member Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. This question is to Jeremy. One of the proposals or the ambitions of the Levelling Up White Paper is to get rid of the 80-20 rule. What impact will the removal of the 80-20 rule have on house building in London?
Yes, I think that is probably best answered by my housing and land colleagues who are sort of deep in negotiations, I think, with Department for Levelling Up on that particular matter. Clearly, though, it risks taking investment away from London, where there is still strong pressure and demand for housing, where housing remains relatively unaffordable compared to other parts of the country and in absolute terms. I think it is another example where the shift in policy risks levelling down investment of affordable housing in the capital.
Thank you. And the other thing is, what would be the impact on London of the increase in cultural investment by arts and councils outside of London?
Again, I wouldn't want to sort of transgress my colleagues in the culture and creative industries team. Clearly, again, it's going to have, it has potentially negative impacts. Perhaps less so, this is a personal view, in terms of London's cultural assets that we already have. But at the margin, it's another example where funding is being taken away from London and put elsewhere, but potentially to good effect in those other parts.
And do you know to what extent the cultural sector in London is funded by the Arts Council of England?
I haven't got those figures to hand.
Would they be available?
I'm sure so, yes.
If they are, perhaps you could send them to the chair of the committee. Thank you.
I mean, I think I'm probably minded on this, and we've had a couple of things that have come up that I think relate to housing and land, and obviously we'll do the normal delegate to the chair in consultation with party group leads, but I suspect that the easiest way to do this will be for our scrutiny team to write to the Deputy Mayor for Housing, Tom Copley, and to write to the Deputy Mayor for Culture, Justine Simons, and somebody from one of their teams can come up with the answers that we've been seeking, but are not immediately to hand for Jeremy. So I think we'll assume that that's something along those lines. You wanted to come in? I think we're moving on from Assembly Member Sahota to you.
Thank you, Chair. I'd actually just be interested to hear what John or Ed think about the about less Arts Council funding for London. I mean, if you've got any views on the contribution of the arts to the economy in London. I mean, we know that that culture is used as a way of of kind of supporting getting new areas in London going. There are sort of affordable workspaces that get given to cultural organisations, and I just wonder if you've got any views on the because I think it's they're planning to increase the cultural investment outside London and spend 100% of the Arts Council funding uplift outside London, yes, sort of the white paper states in culture activities there is a strong skew towards London, which attracts almost 40% of Arts Council grant in aid investment. So yes, do you have any views?
Well, I think I'd start by saying that the cultural sector in London, broadly defined, everything from the Royal Opera House to street theatre, is an enormous source of competitive advantage for the economy of London. It makes London, as a global city, an attractive place to visit, to work, to live. So anything that diminishes that will hit London's competitiveness, would be the sort of first overarching point. Now, the cultural sector, as everybody here knows, had a very, very difficult pandemic because of theatres being closed, museums being closed and so forth, no receipts. The government, I think, did a very good job in providing targeted funding to the culture sector, which kept many institutions, which enabled many institutions to survive through very difficult times. Turning off funding now does seem a bit dysfunctional. And it goes to the heart, I touched on this earlier, but it goes to the heart of what do we mean by levelling up. If levelling up means we spend more money on improving the range of cultural support in the North West, I think that is a good thing. It may be or may not be the priority for the North West. We don't let the North West decide that because it's all done by central government, but it will certainly be a good thing for the North West. If that comes at the expense of existing institutions and support in London, then that is levelling down.
Thank you. Ed, did you want to add anything?
Just briefly, I mean, obviously I defer to John on the substantive policy point, but in terms of sort of the wider sort of governance issue, I think government would need to be very, very clear the reasons and objectives for funding different things in different ways. Are we talking here about funding the development of capacity in cultural institutions in other parts of the country to make them more sustainable? Are we funding something different? What is the outcome? What is the objective of that activity? And what is the ongoing objective for continuing to fund similar activity or different activity in London? And it's only really with that transparency around objectives and around government, I suppose, having an accountability to local people and to the users and those who operate those institutions, that you can make an accurate judgment about whether it's kind of sensible to do that or not. Otherwise, it looks and feels arbitrary.
Thank you, and thank you, for those answers. I think that's really, really helpful. This is the point that this session is about to come to an end, but our next session, our second session, is going to be focusing on further opportunities for devolution in London. So a final question for all of you is, does the Levelling Up white paper go far enough in terms of opportunities for further devolution for London? So I'm going to start at this end and move left to right, so or at our left to right.
Caroline's normal.
Jeremy, if you'd like to go first.
I think the white paper itself is a good start. It helps initiate the dialogue, which will, or sort of reinvigorates the dialogue on devolution. In itself, it doesn't go far enough, and there are references to the white paper about how the government may consider going further in future. Certainly in terms of the ambition set out by both mayors in the Finance Commission reports, the white paper proposes only modest changes with respect to London. So in areas that I've already outlined, we could see further progress.
Thank you. Enver, did you want to contribute anything?
I don't think the paper goes far enough. I think for a 305-page document with lots of lovely graphs, that was interesting. For London, it doesn't go anywhere near enough. Perhaps longer-term funding. There's sort of mention in there around that, and streamlining funding pots. Perhaps giving the mayor more power by taking those pots and deciding how they're allocated. But apart from that, there isn't a great deal there that I can see.
Thank you. John?
No is the one-word answer. As the other witnesses have said, there are some areas where you might have some hope that something may happen, but the truth is, in aggregate, the scale of what's being proposed is simply underwhelming and not enough to meet London's needs.
Thank you. Ed?
Yes, I mean, earlier I said it was kind of thought-provoking. I said it was a sort of, tinged with sort of green. I think it's it is interesting. I think it's the most thoughtful contribution that we've seen from government on this issue for some time, but I think that perhaps tells its own story. I think that the issue for me is the follow-through. I think it sets out some quite worthy and interesting aspirations and aims, but I think it's about the political will to follow those through, and I think it's the political will to follow it through in terms of the relinquishment of control, which is the key issue for me, and I think that still remains to be seen. I think if this government and successive governments are able to follow through in its aspirations for the next decade, as the white paper suggests is going to need to happen, then that will be I'll be very surprised because that kind of cross-government, singular cross-government focus is not necessarily the way that things have worked in the recent past. But yeah.
Thank you. So I think we take away from that for our next meeting that it initiates a dialogue, doesn't go far enough for the longer term. It's a bit underwhelming, and there needs to be the political will to relinquish control of power. So some things to take forward into our next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I've just had a very brief indication that two further Assembly members want to say something. We're actually on track for finishing this section on time, so I'm going to ask Assembly Member Fortune and Duval to be brief, and also brief answers, please. Assembly Member Fortune first.
Thank you very much. So adding to that, and I may have touched on this point lightly earlier, what further powers do you think the Assembly should take from any devolution of power as well? You've got to have the checks and balances that come with any extra powers that the Mayor might have.
I mentioned trust earlier, and if it helps central government to allocate more powers to the Mayor by then empowering the Assembly to scrutinise more, and to give more resource to the Assembly to challenge those devolved powers, then it can only be a good thing, because it means that the Mayor gets to do more as long as the government can trust the Assembly to challenge on its part.
What do you mean by challenge and increased scrutiny? More questions, longer meetings?
Not necessarily longer.
I agree. Power to reject.
You might be on your own with longer meetings, I think, Assembly Member Fortune. 3 hours is generally enough for most of us.
Maybe having a look at some of how the select committees work in the PAC, etc., and the powers they have.
Okay. I mean, we're having this meeting in a building none of us wanted to be in, but it was unilaterally pushed through. So there's got to be the checks to a mayor with increased power.
I don't think that's quite right. I'm pretty sure Assembly Member Boff was very keen to come here because it's practically next door to his house.
That's right.
What he said.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Other than that, as ever.
I'm going to move away from the move to this building and the current powers of the Assembly, and I'm going to bring in Assembly Member Duval.
Okay, just in terms of the future around it, if Esseltine was right in when he came to abolish ILIA and said actually it should be under the borough's control at that stage and where we've developed. We've now got a situation in London where a substantial number of our schools are not controlled by LEAs. They're controlled by central government. And we've got a very complicated inspectorate tier of education with different czars overseeing it. I don't think they're called czars anymore. Is there a role, strategically or with the boroughs, about saying to government, actually, you shouldn't be you should be strategically setting the direction of the education travel standards, in terms of levelling up on overseeing that? Should you not be including strategic authorities or local authorities more about the power over education? I like the view of the business community around that in terms of driving up standards, of being closer to people delivering, but also putting people on the spot. I'm not talking about recreating the past. It's not, Hilliard's gone. We're talking about what do we need in terms of governance and control and devolution from central, regional, maybe not regional, but straight to that. It doesn't, straight to local in terms of delivery around education systems, in raising our power standards still, because we've still got problems in London. It's been great progress. I wouldn't take that away from the educators, but there's still more to do.
So let's bring in John then.
I don't have a view on the optimal structure for the delivery of school level education, but I would agree with the point that Assembly Member Duval makes, that the original ambition of taking schools away from the dead weight hands of local authorities and setting them free appears to be moving into having them subject to control and management by Whitehall, which does not strike me as obviously a positive step. And it's a step that's been taken in a rather stealthy way. There are some decisions that should be taken strategically nationally. There are some decisions that should be taken strategically regionally. And there are some typically operational decisions that are better taken at a more local level. And I think clarity as to who's doing what and why would be helpful from the Department for Education.
Thank you.
An interesting point to, I think I am going to draw it to a close if you don't mind, Ed, because we are otherwise going to run out of time. But I would like to thank all of our guests who've participated in this question and answer session. We do have some further items of business, which is why I'm moving on now. So we will be bringing more people in to speak in a second. You are, of course, completely free to stay in the chamber and listen to our subsequent discussions, should you wish. However, I'd like to ask it won't last more than at least 6 hours, if Assembly Member Fortune has his way. Could I just ask the committee if you are willing to note the report that we received as background to putting the questions to the invited guests, and are you happy to delegate authority to myself as the chair in consultation with the deputy chair and also the party group lead members to agree any outputs from the discussion? I've already indicated that there might be some letters.
Agreed.
Thank you. Right, I'm now going to suggest we have an adjournment so that we can facilitate a new panel of people arriving for the next set of papers. Despite the absence of a couple of Labour colleagues, I'm going to ruthlessly start, because otherwise we'll be here for that 6-hour meeting. I'm just talking briefly. Right, we're going to restart now. So thank you very much to all of you for coming. We are slightly going to change the agenda around so that not everybody has to stay until 9 o'clock or whenever it is that Assemblymember Fortune wants us to continue until. The first item that we're going to take in this section is going to be the outcome of the independent review by the Equal Group. And we'd like Mary to make a few introductory remarks. I think what I would suggest is when you speak, if you can say what your job title is, because none of us can read it from here, and actually it isn't in our notes. Just so when you speak, when you come in, if you just say what your job title is, that would be very helpful. Mary, over to you to introduce the item on the Equal Group. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I hope it's okay. I'm going to share the introduction with Niran Matada, if that's all right, but we know to keep it brief. So to say that we actively commissioned this independent review, partly in response to the situation following the murder of George Floyd and the response in the organisation to that. And our feeling as a senior management team that we really needed to do more to understand the experience of some of our staff and be able to respond perhaps more proactively to that. So that's really sort of how the independent review came about. And then Niran will speak very briefly to its outcomes.
Thank you very much. So I'm Nura Matada and I'm the Executive Director for Strategy and Communications. I also wear another hat as well because I'm also a champion of the Race Equity Network here at the GLA as well. So as Mary has outlined, the independent review investigated our organisational processes, including recruitment, talent management and career development, and shone a light on the experiences of our Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff here at the GLA to say that we have accepted all 42 of the recommendations in the report, and we have set out a summary of those recommendations in the oversight paper. And since it has been published, we have made some progress already. So we have produced an EDI statement, which is in your report. We are in the development of producing an EDI strategy. We have moved to ensure that we have 100% diverse interview panels for all our recruitment, much closer scrutiny on our Grade 10 plus recruitment, and we've also set out now our EDI objectives for all and specific EDI objectives for our managers as well for this performance year. And we've also increased attendance. Let's talk about race. There are other things in the oversight report which I won't go into, but it's just to say that we know we have much more to do. So there is more progress that we need to make, and we will come back to the committee every 6 months on our progress. We are also taking a programme approach to all our diversity and inclusion work. So we are bringing together a single action plan because we realise that some of the recommendations in the Equal Group report cut across a number of protected characteristics. And it's really important that we are able to prioritise and use our resources effectively. And it's also to note as well, just one thing to note is that the data in the Equal Group report is now out of date because when the data was gathered, it was in the third quarter of last year. So I would refer to the workforce report data that we now have as the most up-to-date data. Yes, and that's as much as I wanted to say. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Niran. I'm going to pass over to Assemblymember Pigeon, who's got some points that she wants to put, and I've got some points that I may also wish to put from the Chair. Assemblyman Pigeon.
Yeah, no, I've just got one question, really. I mean, this report is really shocking, and it shows how flawed the GLA is in this area, and for a huge group of our staff, you know, their experience. How are you going to change the culture of this organisation? Because that's not just, I've done my 2-hour training session, tick the box, that's that, moved on. How are you going to change it so that it really is a different place where all our staff can thrive?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. It's a really difficult read. And there are a number of things that we absolutely need to do. This isn't just about data. This is about the lived experience of those people in the organisation. So we can increase our diversity, but we need to ensure that the place that we have is an inclusive one, where everybody is treated equally and fairly, regardless of whatever their protected characteristics might be. There are things that we need to do, and this very much comes out of the recommendations. We need to ensure that all our managers understand and educate themselves, and we are doing this through our leadership objectives. We want to ensure that we actually hold people to account for their behaviour and how they behave within the organisation. We hear this very loudly from our staff, that we need to make sure that when we set out these objectives that they are actually being adhered to, and that is through our performance management, and it has to be. What we also want to create, and we have started to create these, are kind of safe and open spaces where people can come together and they can talk about their experiences, but also we are setting up lived experience forums where we can hear back from how some of the recommendations, the implementation of the recommendations are actually changing the culture within the organisation.
Thank you, Assemblymember Pigeon. Sort of following on from that, how are we going to embed this as meaningful change throughout the GLA, from the top, from the snow-capped peaks, throughout the entire staff? Because we have to go beyond mere policy declarations here, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. I think that one thing that is really important is that this is all of our responsibility, and we have set this out really clearly in our communications. So there is work that we are doing as CMT. There is work that we are held accountable for. So, for instance, with our current Grade 10 recruitment that we are doing, we are scrutinising and ensuring that through every step of that Grade 10 recruitment, Grade 10 plus recruitment, so we're looking at diversity at our most senior levels, that we are applying our policies equitably and fairly, but also the support that we're providing people as well, as they apply for jobs, and also making sure that we're an attractive organisation and that people from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background want to come and absolutely work here. So the embedding of this is not going to happen overnight. There is work that we need to do collectively, and there is work we need to do with our senior management cadre and also our managers, and that in itself is, I think is one of the most important things.
I mean, you just mentioned recruitment, and one of the actions being we do need more diversity on interview panels, but of course that was already a requirement. I mean, without wishing for certain individuals on the staff to spend their whole life in interviewing for other staff, why did we not enforce this earlier? Why has this not been happening? Because we know that there is a halo effect in interviews, and that people do tend to recruit people who are roughly the same age and roughly the same background, and et cetera, et cetera. So, some of this we should have really been tackling before.
I think it's probably best that I take that one, Assemblymember Cooper. So, we've said the report at many levels is shocking. It's a very hard read. One of the things that I was shocked by was that we had previously agreed throughout the organisation that we would have diverse interview panels, and what the report demonstrated was that there was some recruitment going on without diverse panels. Not all recruitment, but some recruitment. And, for me, we've made clear that that's what should be happening. I'm told it's happening, but then somebody who looks independently, properly at what's happening tells me actually it's not 100% happening. And I guess that's really the shift now that we've taken, which is when we say something should be happening, we absolutely mean it. So the executive directors, some of whom are sitting around this table, are now responsible to me to assure me that actually every interview happening in their areas is happening with a diverse panel. And if a diverse panel isn't available, the recruitment stops. So we sort of move to a different level of mandating behaviour. But to your point, which I think was your main question, how do we then make sure that it's not the same people who are every single time being asked to support interviews? And actually, when you look at it more deeply, you find actually that we have something like 130 staff, Black and Asian and minority ethnic staff, who are trained to sit on recruitment panels. So then you think, well, hang on, that's quite a large number of people. And of course, what has been happening is people have been trying to recruit to their panels from the very small pools of their own teams, or maybe them and the adjacent team. But now what we're saying is actually we're going to hold a pool of trained and willing people that from which people needing panellists come in to HR, who are brokering that pool. Actually, Beth's here from HR. Say, actually, I know I can offer you, these people willing and able to join you on your panel. We're having to be much more open in our thinking. So again, policy used to dictate, or practice dictated, that you only had somebody on your panel if they were the same grade as or at least within a grade of the job that you were recruiting to. Well, actually, we're saying we're going to move away from that. Much more important is diversity of thought and experience on the panel rather than grades. So we're just having to think about it differently, and actually it doesn't take much different thinking to be able to say, actually, we can do this. The thing that we really don't want to do is continually put burdens on the same people. No. Again, the Equal Report talks about that, doesn't it? The emotional labour that we've asked some people to put to this. But again, we're thinking hard about that, and of course talking to our community of Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff about how they feel they can support this, while recognising that absolutely in the end it's the responsibility and accountability of the organisation.
Okay, well, so you point out that you're going to come back every 6 months, so we'll look forward to an update of how that's being rolled out. But for an organisation that has just moved from Southwark, which I don't know the precise diversity statistics for the borough, the number of languages, the number of people of different heritage who live there, but Southwark is an incredibly diverse borough. We've just moved to Newham, which I think is supposed to be the most diverse borough in London. I seem to remember 143 different languages spoken, and so on and so forth. London is an incredibly diverse city. People come here from all around the world. Many of us sitting around the table, our family heritage is either ourselves individually born abroad, or our parents or our grandparents, and we're here in London. How are we going to make sure that we do make the GLA feel welcoming? How are we going to get the message out that we are an employer that people would want to choose, at school fairs when people are leaving school, or when people have come to London to go to university? How are we going to make those contacts to make sure that the candidates who are coming through, who are then being interviewed by these more diverse panels, how are we going to make that happen more effectively? Having done some interviewing just before Christmas for a variety of reasons, the diversity of people applying for more senior roles, for example, because I was mainly interviewing on those, was I wasn't overwhelmed by the diversity, shall I just put it that way? So that's a really important thing that we need to do. Is that maybe something that Niran would like to come in on?
Yeah,
I can see that you would like to come in.
Yeah, I'm happy to start and hand over to my colleagues as well. So there are a couple of, there are some really good initiatives going on in this organisation, and actually this is one of the things that the Equal Group report picks up is the consistency in some of those good initiatives, where where there are some recruitment where we have some open days where people can come along, where we target particular universities, etc. So there are some good initiatives, but we need to be a bit more consistent about those. The other thing I would say as well is we need to think about where we advertise, and that in itself is really critical. No disrespect to just The Guardian, but we need to think about kind of where it is that we're advertising, because if we take a much more targeted approach to our recruitment, and we've started to do this now with some of our more senior grades, then that will make a difference. But that's not the only single thing. And again, we need to be consistent across the piece.
Yes, and using the relevant pieces of legislation to say that people are particularly encouraged to apply for roles at this level because they are currently underrepresented, I think is really important. I think, you know, let's make sure that we are doing that. I'll just bring in Assembly Member Best, who wants to come in now as well.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to understand more clearly what a diverse interview panel is.
Yeah, we've done some work to define that. Beth?
First of all, hello, I'm Beth Cushion. I'm here representing HR, stepping in for Shakira Keddo, the Assistant Director for People who can't be with us today. So yes, we are now making a firm commitment to move to 100% diverse panels. That means reflecting as best as possible the diversity of London. So we know the diversity rates of London, we've got them here, so it's 39% Black and Asian minority ethnic colleagues, 50% women, and it's about representing those people as best as possible in our panels.
You don't mention LGBT or people with who are differently abled or anything like that. Are we also going to be taking those into consideration on the panels as well?
Yes, but we can't have all those differences represented on every panel. But yes, across the panels, we're constantly looking at that, at matching that representation.
You can't just, I think, look at you know, whether or not people are male or female. Or,
no, and we're not.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I think you've kind of got to the crux of my point here. Is that's why I'm trying to understand a diverse interview panel, because that clearly would change for, say, every interview. You could have, you know, a disabled candidate, and you could have a Black, Asian, minority ethnic candidate, and you may well want a diverse panel for both, but in the same interview for the same job, you are clearly going to struggle to do both. And so how do we avoid getting into this kind of diversity interview panel top trumps of, you know, that's what I'm kind of concerned, and I just wanted a bit more definition about how that's been avoided and how it is that this panel is going to make sure that you know, it works.
So can we share with the panel afterwards the definition, because we have issued a definition of a diverse panel, I think that would be helpful.
Yes.
With the committee. The second thing, though, to say is that you know, we are looking and judging where we fall most short in terms of representation compared to the London population. And at the moment, where we fall most short is our representation internally of Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff and disabled staff versus the London population. That doesn't mean to say we don't worry about the other characteristics, but that is where we fall most short, and where our EDI statement is clear and our EDI strategy is clear. Those are the areas of top priority at the moment. So again, you see that reflected as well in our panel guidance.
I think we'll be looking forward to receiving the 6 monthly update reports and talking further on this important matter. Just see Caroline Russell wants to come in. Assemblymember Russell?
Sorry, yes, just very briefly. I just wanted to reflect on the way that the sort of challenges around EDI recruitment reflect on our work on the Assembly. We've just had a panel discussion where our guests were 4 older white men. I believe the Economy Committee and Budget and Performance have recently had all-male panels, and Transport Committee next week, which has been cancelled, had an all-white panel. So these, you know, and we are meant to represent Londoners, and actually that looks, you know, it's really not, we really need to do better.
I am going to stop you. That is actually a matter for the Scrutiny and Committee Services teams, and is a slightly separate issue, and I know that certainly it wasn't my choice that we had the makeup of the previous panel, and I know that Scrutiny and Committee Services do give a lot of attention to that, but I think that's a slightly
Chair, it is a
different
separate
area.
question, but because at the levels within the GLA of people who are coming to speak to us, there is not enough diversity. that actually reflects on all our work, and I think we should acknowledge that.
In the sense that two of the people on the last panel were GLA employees. Okay. Mary, did you want to come in on that?
Only to say that, of course, what happens in this chamber is very visible around the building. And I had noticed that, and I was talking to Helen about that just earlier. I think you are right, Chair. You know, there is a responsibility on the Secretariat to make sure that that changes. I think, and Helen and I were talking about this, we need to push back on some of those organisations and say to them, how come it is every time we ask you to send somebody, you present a white man, for example. But because I think it is really important for the work of the Assembly, I would say that with my Assembly hat on.
I think it's something that we will have to continue to work on because, as you've correctly pointed out, it was not exactly a glowing success in the earlier part of the meeting. However, I am going to ask if Assembly members are happy to note the outcome of the independent review by the Equal Group and the action that the Chief Officer is taking in response. And we will look forward, Mary, to getting that update that you just referred to. I'm going to move on then to item 10. We are slightly moving the agenda just for the convenience of some of the guests. This one is on the proposed changes to the GLA Establishment, Environment and Energy and Group Treasury. And I believe that Phil, Catherine and Luke are likely to be those who might want to say something about this paper. Don't forget to say what your role is. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for bringing forward the item, which is on my account, so I'm extremely grateful. I wasn't going to introduce in any great length. Indeed, I didn't think you wanted an introduction, but this was just to say that these changes are a direct response to the Mayor's announcement in the final version of the budget that was published in March to provide new funding to support the development of a green bond. And obviously the creation of a £500 million green bond is a very significant task and requires the resources to be able to take that forward. And this is the way in which we have responded to that challenge across the Environment team and the Treasury team. So
Assemblymember Pigeon wanted to raise a couple of points with you.
Yes, I did. Thank you for this paper. When I met with the team to discuss the Green Bond, to understand it, I understood there would be some additional recruitment, but I wasn't expecting it to be 9 posts in total. Is that really necessary?
I think the short answer is yes, but the slightly long answer is that the Green Bond is only the first task in a broader programme of work to A, establish the wider green finance facility that the Mayor has committed to establish, and B, to be able to undertake the work that we have committed to do around carbon budgeting as well. So while these 9 members of staff will in the first instance be focused around the establishment of the Green Bond, which is a not inconsiderable task, particularly when it comes to the financial and carbon reporting that goes around that, which any investor will absolutely require before they'll be prepared to put their money in. That's the urgent task, but as that gets up and running, there is a broader range of work to undertake to establish the wider finance facility and look at new options for bringing private finance into this area, and to ensure that we understand the carbon implications of our budgeting more widely. I mean, Luke may wish to come in a little more on the Treasury aspects of that.
Thanks, Phil. Luke Webster, the Chief Investment Officer. In addition to the things Phil has just pointed out, it's worth pointing out that we manage nearly 5 billion of assets on behalf of the GLA, but also the functional bodies, the LPFA, shortly to be joined by London Borough, and we are actively recruiting others to join that collective investment vehicle. It allows us to deliver considerable economies of scale and operational resilience to the GLA and its partners. But everybody will be well aware of the trend in investment finance to focus more, quite rightly, on ESG and particularly climate change. What that means is that we have to be I think, at the head of the curve in terms of having the best policies and implementation of these non-financial overlays. So we want to continue to deliver excellent risk-adjusted returns, but do so in a way that has the most positive available social impact. As the paper sets out, most of the authority's investment management activity is delivered by a regulated company, London Treasury Limited, and you may have seen in the press over recent months there's been much greater incidence of regulatory action by international regulators on financial services companies for greenwashing and similar traits. So we need to make sure that not only do we have good policies, but for regulatory reasons we need to make sure that we implement those very robustly, and that requires some resource. But we've been able to generate quite considerable additional returns as a result of our modified strategy, capturing these opportunities which are attractive but also deliver ESG benefits, and that will fund that additional cost.
Thank you for that. I think I really think this is an exciting programme, and I really do. I think the issue for me here is about process, actually, taking a step back, because 4.4 in this report says this 90 million funding commitment came at the end of the budgeting process for 22-23, and it's not currently reflected in the staffing budgets for the Environment and Energy Unit or Treasury. Well, if it's not in the budget this year, then surely this should be a growth bid for next year. Because in the Assembly, I would like the Assembly to have far more resources. Can we suddenly mid-year come up with a growth plan because we're committed to it and suddenly we find money to fund it? No, this was outside of the budget process. I was very unhappy at the time and made this point at the final budget meeting because this wasn't in the draft budget. It wasn't in any way available for us to scrutinise. And you're not telling me, and we had that discussion, Luke, when I met with you and David Galley, that in the sort of few weeks between the draft budget and final budget, you suddenly came up with this idea. It should have been in the budget process. I'm afraid I want to put on record that I don't support this, not because I don't support the programme. It's about the process. It's a misuse of the process that actually this should have gone through the normal budget process and we should have been able to scrutinise it much earlier. And so I'm not prepared to support a growth of 9 staff today.
When are we first going to see any of the investment opportunities identified, would you say? You can fight amongst yourself as to who answers, but I want an answer.
In terms of how we're dividing up the work, the Environment team are working most closely with the functional bodies in identifying those projects where things will be deployed. We've had an excellent response from LFB so far, and we're aware of good work in the others. We've set a deadline for the end of July to our colleagues in the functional bodies, so hopefully we'll have more concrete information.
End of July, so we should have something concrete, so we would be able to have you come back to a future meeting of oversight to tell us more about what's been identified. What are the timescales for delivery after the investment opportunities are identified? Because that's obviously the next thing, once something is identified, delivery.
Sure. So having identified the projects, we would then go through a ranking process to identify the expenditure that has the maximum carbon reduction impact per pound. We would hope to conclude that analysis subject to being able to bring these resources in towards the end of September, and there would be a mayoral decision potentially allocating some of the revenue funding that's discussed in the report. That's the 86 million that can support some of these bids. The mayoral decision will set out that first tranche of investments. Because of the GLA's current liquidity strength, we're not necessarily under enormous pressure to issue the bond immediately as we commit to these projects. We'd have some flexibility there to look for the optimal market timing.
Okay. The paper suggests that in the medium and longer term that future investments will be financed by return on investments and possibly reserves when necessary. How will you ensure that you maximise ROI so that we don't need to use the reserve funding, or if we do, that we minimise reliance on it as much as possible?
And certainly, to the extent that we're deploying these green bond proceeds within the public sector, we have very high certainty that the money will come back. Obviously, what we'll be looking to do will be to deploy as much as possible in a way that doesn't require use of the revenue subsidy. So the things that wash their own face, as it were, would be put to the front of the queue, and we would be allocating the subsidy only to those things that really deliver a very substantial benefit. So that rationing system will become integrated within the group budget as a rolling process over the forthcoming years.
Catherine.
If I may, Catherine Barber, Assistant Director for Environment and Energy. We absolutely are looking to find the projects that do produce returns, and we're talking to the functional bodies, the members of the GLA group, and also strategic partners beyond, to make sure that they're thinking in terms of those investable propositions. But if they were fully commercial, they would already be going out and finding other sources of finance. And so that's why the Mayor has made this offer available in order to try to maximise the carbon impacts of some of these projects. And so we do think there's a role for that kind of blended finance where the Mayor's contribution alongside that £500 million that will be raised from the market can help to make those ambitious projects happen.
No, we do understand that, but I just wanted to get a feel for the balance between reliance on ROI and reserves. I can see that Assemblymember Duval now wants to come in as well.
Yeah, I think this is quite exciting to go through, but it does beg some questions here about who's holding the ring and who's accountable. So who can I sack if it goes wrong? I mean, it's as clear as that. I think it's quite clear about the London Treasury Limited. We've got some history and some involvement, and there are some clear lines here. What you're introducing here is I've got finance involved, I've got environment involved, and I've got, who else have I got involved? A third party around that. Who's holding the ring and who trumps who? Who's going to be pushing for something, I'm more for risk-taking, but there's risk-taking here. And actually about that. So how do you withstand the pressures? What are we going to do it? Who's going to have the final say in the investment issues? So that's the bit I'm unclear, because there is a track record here, but it's a different one than what's being proposed at the moment. Because what you're telling me here is delivery requires expertise. I get that, but who's taking the final decision? Where's that clarity in terms of this scheme? What is it?
Well, ultimately, the decisions, as it says in para 4.5, will be taken by the steering group, which is chaired by the Mayor's Chief of Staff, and that's where the different parts of the GLA that you refer to come together to consider the proposals that might be invested in, and to take it forward. In terms of officers, while there are individuals working on the different areas in both on the programme as a whole, in both the environment team and the Treasury team, the programme director sits within the Treasury team and reports to our head of climate change and up to the the environment team, and reports to our assistant director for environment and energy. So that's where the overall programme ownership is, and that's where we keep track of whether this is going right, and we make sure that that the objectives that have been set for this project are being delivered.
So, as a scrutineer then, what do I receive? Don't start telling me about commercial confidentiality and all the rest of it. How do I keep an eye about what the role of this delivery team is doing? Right? Where do we, in that sense of lobbying, we know, you just told me, Catherine, that actually some of these investments are not being touched. We're going to be going into a bit of the Wild West here, aren't we? We're going to be looking at some of the developments or project opportunities that maybe someone else is not going to take a punt on, and we're going to take a punt because we're going to be chasing the carbon reduction issues. Nothing wrong in that, but you go in with your eyes open about what the risks are. So the question then is, so what information do we get as scrutineers or about that public money is going into this area of investment? See, I'm quite safe because I think the London Treasury Limited gives me that issue that Luke said about the regulatory issues, we're now introducing, so you're putting politics into it, I don't mind, Chief of Staff, right, okay, you're meant to give me confidence, so I want a little bit more, so you then tell me there's some other people sitting around the table, and yes, there are some named individuals around that table, but actually, I'm not so clear about the clarity that you're trying to suggest to me in the paper about that, some of those issues. And I think you need to do some more work on that, around that, to give me as much comfort as what would give me in terms if I was going down the London Treasury Limited issues, which is regulated. This is not. This is a different fund and a different way of working this fund. And I'm not clear that you've done that, some of that thinking around that as a public body to give me some comfort as someone who has to scrutiny your work.
Assembly Member, I'm glad that you're excited about the prospect of the bond and the fact that we can be making these investments. I think we have to recognise that with a target of net zero by 2030 for London, we have to take risks, we have to innovate, we have to do things that people haven't done before. It's an enormously ambitious target, it's proportionate to the climate crisis, but we will not be able to get there by doing things that are comfortable and familiar and safe because they've been done many times before. So we're in that territory. My team's job will be to draw on the expertise and the professional qualifications, and with full respect for Luke and colleagues. So if the question of are we issuing the bond correctly according to the right processes and so forth, Luke and co will be accountable for that. But in terms of are we coming up with the pipeline for projects, which right now we do not have at the level required, and that's why we've got this bid for staffing, to be able to engage with the functional bodies, to be able to engage with boroughs, with housing associations, public sector institutions in London. That's my team's responsibility, and you can hold me responsible for that. And we can give you dates about when we expect to issue the prospectus, for example. That will be the next public step. And as we've said, by the end of July, we should know internally whether we think we're on track for that. But that prospectus will be published. Our plan is in autumn.
I think we would like some dates. I think that's a very welcome proposal, and I think we'd also like some regular reports to be established, perhaps a short report in 3 months' time and then a more fuller report in 6 months' time. This is a whole new area, and I think you can hear from the Assembly members their interest in how it's going to function. And I think we would appreciate being able to see that regularly at this committee. I'm sorry, I slightly interrupted Luke, who wanted to come in as well.
I was probably preempting the request. I think it is a very fair challenge, and Assembly members are no doubt aware that the GLA does have a number of pockets of investment, for instance, the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund and other things that are happening externally. One of the things that my team has been looking at as a long-term strategic objective is to consolidate all of those exposures, and we'd be delighted to share that reporting. It's something that we need to understand as part of our financial risk oversight.
Thank you. And some of those deadlines that you've referred to, I think, would be very welcome. But I think if we can establish some reporting going forward, I think that would be helpful, because then we can continue to scrutinise a whole new area of work. The committee is asked to respond to the Chief Officer's... sorry, Assembly Member Fortune wanted to come in as well.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to pick up on the point that Assembly Member Pidgeon made, sort of now stepping into the role as Chairman at Budget and Performance, is what happened there. Why wasn't it in that budget process? Luke, you just talked about long-term planning, so this must have been, there must have been some thought behind this. I think you said that the GLA had current liquidity strength, which means you got a few quid, right? So this was projected. So why wasn't it in that budget process? And how can I be reassured as the new chairman that this kind of thing won't come and bite me again in the future? And I'd quite like to see some of these reports come back through budgets as well.
It's probably for me to answer that, and if members are okay, I've said to Phil he should go, because there's an appointment he just needs to get to, if that's okay. So I think Assembly Member Fortune, this goes back, doesn't it, to Assembly members' concerns about the budget process that we have talked about before. We are getting some significant sums coming into that process very late in the day that we as officers need to respond to late as well. I have spoken with Assembly group leaders about what can we do around the budget process in the future. We've had an audit report related to that as well. I think maybe I should speak to you in your new capacity about that in more detail. But we are looking forward to try and change that.
I think that's very welcome, and I think you should take that offline, because that is a budget and performance issue rather than something for us.
But I'm understanding that wasn't on the horizon when the budget process had started. I'll pick that up outside.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So the committee is asked to respond to the Chief Officer's consultation on the proposed changes to the Skills and Employment unit. Can I see those who are happy with the changes? And I think I'm going to do this by show of hands. All those in favour? Could you put your hand up if you're in favour, because I know some people aren't. Is that acceptable? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can I see those who are against? And that's 4 against. Okay, so that's agreed. I'm now going to move on to item 7. So we're actually moving back to item 7, which I suspect that Mary will answer any questions that we may have on this, because this is to do with the GLA elections 2024. There's always something to look forward to, isn't there? Consideration of counting arrangements, and the report was on pages 39 to 44. And Assemblymember McCartney indicated earlier on that she had some points that she might wish to raise, and I'd just say to officers who have finished their presentations, do feel free to go, feel free to stay as well, though. Assemblymember McCartney.
Yes, Mary, you've obviously made the decision to manually count, and I suppose my question is particularly around if we have a general election on the same day. And just looking at, and I think some of this will be when the timing of a general election would be, and what complexities there may be further added to the scenarios we have here. So, for example, if the existing parliamentary boundaries are the same, they will be counting in old wards. We will be counting, I'm assuming, in new ward boundaries that have changed over the last 12 months. And similarly, if we are in the new parliamentary boundaries, then we go, I think, from 10 existing seats, parliamentary constituencies that go over 2 boroughs, to 30 that will cross over boroughs. Now, I understand that the validation of our ballots has to be done on the same day, but it just seems to me there's added complexities about how we do that. And has that been factored into your decision?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, the risk of a combined GLA election and general election in May 24, which consider a relatively high risk, is one of the 2 drivers of this decision.
No, I understand
and
that.
Right, but just the yes, and the complexity around the boundaries is absolutely
has been
in that mix, and is going to make the whole thing very complicated. But our judgment, working with the returning officers and election managers right across London, is that us moving to a manual count is the best thing to be doing in the circumstances.
Thank you. I think there's a whole host of other questions, but I don't think it's necessarily to the point about whether we count manually or not. But I'm assuming that we'll be coming back to that at a later stage when we look at the next GLA elections. Thank you.
I mean, I've had the opportunity to ask Mary quite a lot of questions in the lead up to this meeting about this, and I think it's a really difficult decision. Obviously, the best thing will be is if the elections do not coincide. So anyone who'd like to have a word with the relevant parties who could potentially be moving an election around, carry on with that. I can see Assemblymember Pigeon would like to come in as well.
Yes, sorry, I forgot I had a couple of questions on this as well. If we do end up with elections on the same day, you're going to have huge numbers of staff, count staff, that the boroughs will sort out. But are you looking to have a separate group of staff who will then come in, whether it's, in the years gone by, I used to go to banks to get banking staff and so on rather than... But are you going to be looking, because people will be tired, and the pressure of a general election count, there's extra pressure there. Are you looking with the boroughs to have another group of counting staff who can come in fresh? And obviously you're going to have a work programme and schedule that you're developing as this goes along. Will you be able to share this with us regularly so we can be updated on how these things are progressing?
So yes to the second question. So I've got Alex and AJ with me today. Lee's not here, but we're sort of the core team of 4. We'll work with the Secretariat and the Chair to work out a schedule of as we ramp up to 2024. We did that in the ramp up to 2020 before 2020 was postponed to 21. So very happy to do all of that. Because actually this decision, as the paper says, the decision to count manually also changes the programme. So we're working very hard now on the new programme. On the staffing question, yes, so we'll have 2 plans. We'll have a plan for a combined election with a general election. Of course, and if that happens, the GLA election will be the secondary election in that. So that's got its own complications. Then we'll have a plan for a standalone GLA election. Staffing, particularly for the combined, but even for the standalone, is probably absolutely up there in the top 3 issues. Alex and I were at the London Elections Management Board just last week, and of course they were reflecting on the May elections. The London elections just happened, and staffing was, everybody managed it and it all happened very smoothly, but they were reflecting that staffing had been more of an issue than normal. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. And so we have already agreed that staffing and thinking about the staffing of a combined election is probably one of our top 3 issues for 2024, working with the boroughs. And we've got to do with them some very creative thinking.
We will come to our Oversight Committee work programme, but again, I think this is another area, because it's such a significant change from the way in which we've run the counts before for the GLA elections. We will be expecting regular reports on this. Is there anyone else who wants to raise any further issues relating to item 7 on the agenda? In which case, could I ask that the committee notes the Greater London Returning Officer's proposed decision on the counting of the GLA elections 2024. Is that noted?
Noted.
Thank you. Hopping around in the agenda again, we're now going to come to the workforce report, which is number 9, which is on pages 127 to 202. And we have Mary, Beth and Helen, I think, are going to answer our questions. And I think Assembly Member Caroline Pidgeon had some points that she wanted to raise.
Just one question from me. Some posts I know need to be fixed term. I'm coming back to the same old issue. Are you satisfied you've made enough progress to minimise fixed term posts, given it's still at 13% in this report?
I think that is about right, yes. It fluctuates a little bit, but I think that's right. Beth, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think it's appropriate that any organisation has, as part of its workforce strategy, fixed-term contracts. It gives us the flexibility to bring people in on a short-term basis for time-bound projects or where there's time-bound funding. It also gives us the flexibility to bring people in to cover for mat leave or sabbatical cover or secondment cover. So it's inevitable that we will always have a degree of fixed-term contracts. I personally feel comfortable with 13%. And yeah, as Mary has said to this committee before, we will keep a close eye on it as part of the budget setting process and when we're supporting the business areas when in talking about their workforce planning. But I personally feel that it's appropriate.
And so you have a check as well on all of these posts to make sure that it's correct. Obviously, maternity leave cover, that sort of thing. I understand there'll be percentage. And also, I don't know where 13% compares to other organisations that are similar.
I don't think we've looked at that comparison. I don't know whether it is something that's regularly available, but I think what I can do, Assemblymember Pigeon, and some people around this table will experience this, is we do challenge the creation of every post, a permanent or fixed term. And the choice of fixed term versus permanent, we also challenge. Because we were in such a poor position when I arrived in this, so I'm determined that we keep this one right.
Thank you. Moving on from fixed term to agency, I think when you last brought the workforce report to the committee, you said that the number of agency staff would decrease, which it has, from 98 FTE to 87.6. Is that where we're going to finish, or are we going to still try and reduce the number of agency staff still further?
So yeah, the report highlights that we have decreased our agency numbers, albeit slightly. I think that reflects in part the significant increase in recruitment. So the slide deck shows that we've had a 50% increase this last year. We know that around 72% of the agency workers that we have are covering established posts. So as we start to see some of the backlogs in recruitment reduced, we would expect to see those numbers come down. So there is a degree of rigour around appointment of agency workers. Any requests need to go through to an establishment control process that Mary personally chairs. So we are monitoring it. I would expect to see it come down. Much like fixed term contracts, there's always a place and a need for agency workers to kind of cover unforeseen work that we hadn't anticipated. But yes, we will continue to monitor that and hope to see it decrease further.
I'm not disputing that you need agency staff from time to time. I was just trying to establish whether or not you thought there was going to be a further decrease, which I think is what you're saying, and that as we deal with the recruitment backlogs, or indeed the slowness of recruitment, both of which I think we're all familiar with. We also have the issue of turnover. The London Assembly turnover was 28%, and in the Mayor's office at 25%. And I think in February 2022, so this year, you told us that was attributable to fixed term person agency staff. So are we going to see that dropping as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very happy, Chair, to come in on the Assembly side of things. I mean, I think both on the agency staff and the turnover point. So on agency, you look in the pack, we do have it's a small number comparatively to the organisation, but it's a good example of a scenario in which we would expect that number to come down as Beth says, the recruitment into those established permanent posts continues to increase up. We've got a large number of recruitment processes underway at the moment. I mean, I think from our point of view on turnover, you will all be well aware of a number of the significant changes that have happened over that period of time. Obviously, the restructures across a number of areas playing into that position. So again, I would expect that number to stabilise from specifically from a secretariat point of view. I mean, I think we've talked before about the overall turnover across the organisation and the extent to which we expect that to change in a kind of forward-looking position. I mean, I think, as Beth says, huge amount of ongoing work into recruitment, which again means you should see that stabilising. But certainly from an Assembly Secretariat point of view, I think the picture, our expectation, our hope is that picture will be very different over the coming months.
Okay, I think we're going to look forward to receiving the next report so that we can see further improvements. Also, I assume that you'll be able to tell us whether or not there's any difference in terms of turnover, whether it's higher for staff from particular groups in terms of protected characteristics, and whether or not, bearing in mind our previous discussion about the Equal Report, whether we're attracting people in who then decide to leave very quickly because they feel uncomfortable in the organisation or for whatever reason. So I hope we're monitoring all of that as well. I'm just going to check. I can see Assemblymember Best would like to come in, and then we'll close this discussion.
Thanks, Chair. Mary, in the previous report, and heard you repeat a few times that we want to represent the working population of London. So when you see that we have got 61% of women working for the organisation and 49% of the working population in London is women, does that mean we need to recruit more men?
don't think we need to actively seek to recruit more men, and we're not doing that. So like I said, at the moment, our priority is redressing our shortfalls on black, Asian, minority, ethnic staff and disabled staff. But, you know, we need to keep an eye on it. We need to keep an eye on it.
Okay, thanks. That's interesting. Do you think perhaps it shows the difficulty we have in these kind of arbitrary targets in ignoring intersectionality of challenges people face and who we recruit?
Sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to ask me that again.
So do you think by looking, perhaps, you're not concerned that obviously there's a large percentage of women compared to men in the organisation, and I'm asking, do you think that kind of sheds light on the difficulty of having arbitrary targets, because it kind of doesn't show the intersectionality of our workforce and how that is important? So, for example, you know, you say you're not particularly concerned that we don't have many men in the organisation compared to women, but perhaps it's better to, is there something to unpick there? Why are we not concerned? You know, there might be a lot of men in London looking for jobs in a certain demographic, and you know, to just kind of say we're not concerned perhaps shows the difficulty with arbitrary targets on workforce.
I think where I do agree with you is I think we need to get a much sharper focus on intersectionality and understand that much better. In fact, the Equal Group tells us that, actually some of the data that the Chair was just asking us for will require us to look much more closely at intersectionality. So I think is an area where we do need to look at, and that will help us, as you say, Assembly Member Best, unpick some of these headline percentages.
It's certainly a very important point, though. I mean, it's probably a group that you're not deeply familiar with, Assembly Member Best, but certainly after 1997, when 101 Labour women MPs were elected to Parliament, the diversity of the Parliamentary Labour Party, although it was massively improved in terms of the number of women, fell away in terms of a number of other diversity aspects. So I think there is an important point not to be lost here in terms of you know, if you fill an organisation with white heterosexual women, then you are missing out in terms of a number of other diversity aspects as well.
I take the point, but I am confident if we look at it and we can present it back, is that the diversity of the women joining the organisation is good.
Yeah, I think
but you're right, we need to demonstrate that.
Thank you. Are there any other comments on the workforce report that anyone would like to raise at this point? If not, can I ask the committee, are you happy to note the workforce report? Okay, so the next item that we need to deal with, and thank you very much to those members of staff who've been responding to those questions, is the GLA Oversight Committee work programme, which at the moment is still slightly an outline, but we are going to be nailing down most of the details of that, including some of the regular reports we've just referred to. Are you happy to note the work programme mostly in outline at the moment, Assembly Member Pigeon?
And just to put formally on record at committee, I know it's being sorted. We've still got 3 outputs from last year when I was chair that we're still waiting for, and I'm expecting a timescale for that, I believe, today. But just so members are aware, we will have 3 further outputs from last year.
Absolutely. That's something I have discussed with the Senior Policy Advisor and also with, I think it was with Mary actually as well, at one of the call-over meetings, and we will make sure that those are progressed. The next item on the agenda, if everyone's happy to note that, is the date of the next meeting, which is 13th of July, and we'll be here at 2 p.m. And the next item of business is any other business which I consider to be urgent. I do not consider any business to be urgent, and I declare this meeting closed. Thank you.